燃え上がれガンダム。
Hello and welcome to Weekly Suit Gundam, the special bonus podcast brought to you by the folks at the Weekly Stuff Podcast. I am Sean Chapman.
And I'm Jonathan Lack.
And we are here once again to dive into the wacky and wonderful world of Gundam, but not with some old crusty Gundam. We're here with some brand new, fresh out of the package, like that new car smell ass Gundam. Because Jonathan, we are not reviewing an old piece of Gundam media. We are reviewing the brand new movie, Mobile Suit Gundam Hathaway's Flash, as its original title is, or its title, as it got brought over here, Mobile Suit Gundam Hathaway, which just on July 1st premiered on Netflix in the US, which is about a month after it came out in Japan. So this is some brand new fucking Gundam, and we are here to talk about it.
Yes, we fucking are. I am so excited. We've both been very excited for this movie, which was delayed a very long time by COVID. This was supposed to come out over a year ago. Now it is out. It is the first of a trilogy adapting a series of novels from the late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah, 89 to 90.
89 to 90. I was right. By Yoshiyuki Tomino, that are a direct sequel to Char's Counterattack, following the exploits of young Hathaway Noa. And that is all I will say for now, because don't be spoiled. This is normally we don't care about spoilers here on this podcast because it's old stuff and you're adults and you can watch it. But this is a brand new movie, and there's no excuse. It's on Netflix. You can go watch it whenever you want.
Yep.
So go watch the movie and then come back and listen to this podcast. But I guess we can give our first quick impressions here, Sean. What did you think?
I think it's fucking amazing. It's full 2 thumbs up. I think it is a great movie. I know that you watched it twice. I also watched it twice, so watched it the night it came out and then watched it last night before we doing this recording. And yeah, I think it is just like top to bottom a pretty amazing film. Like, people going into it, people should know a couple of things. One, it is very much a sequel to Char's Counterattack, meaning that if you have not seen Char's Counterattack, a lot of elements of this movie are going to be very confusing. So make sure that if you haven't gotten around to that particular side of Gundam and watched original Gundam and Char's Counterattack at the very least, you need to do that. And that also this is part 1 of 3 movies. So I think my only real complaint about the movie is I think there's a little bit of like messiness is maybe the wrong way to put it, but there's like extra stuff in the third act that feels like it's there mostly because there are certain characters that are going to be important in subsequent movies that don't have a lot to do in this film. But other than that, I think, which is fine because it is the first of 3 movies. But other than that, I think it is like as good a Gundam movie as you can really ask for. It has just some amazing dialogue, because so much of the movie is very dialogue heavy. And it's Tomino dialogue. They're just pulling it from the novel. And so the 3 main characters, Hathaway, Gigi, and Kenneth, are all so fascinating. They've got that rich kind of complex characterization and psychological makeup that you're kind of picking away at over the course of the movie in that very Tomino style. And they do that so good. And then this movie has just some of the best mecha animation I've ever seen in anything. It only has 2 big mecha action sequences, one in the middle and one at the end, but both of them I think are kind of like all-timers for Gundam, and it's just a very different perspective and like style and direction for how you do mecha stuff, and I just think both sides of it, the story, the Tomino, the psychology, like all that stuff, the themes, incredibly rich in this movie. And then also if you want to see some just like really amazing Gundam like action sequences, this movie has some of my favorites. So And it's got an amazing soundtrack, got amazing sound design, just all around. I think it's a great movie.
Yeah, I second all of that. You know, I watched it twice as well, and I really enjoyed it even more the second time because there is just so much going on that I think your first viewing, because this movie very much drops you in the middle of the story. It is not a, like, from the beginning to the end story. It is just, you're in the middle of the stuff, and you're kind of piecing it together. And we'll talk more about that in specifics later. But it's very dense. It is really different. It is one of the most different Gundam things I think we've talked about, because it is mostly dialogue. There are those two big sequences you're talking about that are standout, and I agree with everything you said about their mecha stuff. But those are 20 minutes of the movie, maybe, and this is a 100-minute movie. For the most part, this is people talking, and it is incredibly well done, but it is very dense, it is very slow, it is very deliberate, and it is very novelistic, honestly, in that sense, too. And that is something very special, but you should know what you're getting into with it. And it is also part one. And I think on its own, just purely as its own movie, I wouldn't put this on par with, you know, some of the other Gundam movies we've watched, like Char's Counterattack or F-91 or Awakening of the Trailblazer. But I can very easily see that once we have the whole trilogy, that the Hathaway's Flash trilogy as a whole will be one of maybe the most special Gundam things. Does that sound like a fair assessment?
Yes, yeah. It's a thing where, you know, I think it's frustrating that we are definitely going to be, you know, caught up fully with Weekly Suit Gundam well before this trilogy of movies is finished, because I don't know how the fuck you rank just this movie.
Yes.
But yes, yeah, it is definitely, there's a little bit of messiness, but I do think it is, around it being the first of a trilogy on its own, but I do think it is like a very satisfying movie unto itself if you recognize that some of the stuff at the end is just kind of hanging on to be further developed in a sequel.
Yeah, and honestly, I didn't even feel that messiness you're talking about. We'll get into it specifics later. I just think it's a little, you know, it is part one. It is an introduction to this world that does not then necessarily push these characters to the places they're going to need to go to be fully articulated characters. But it is, as an Act 1, I don't think it could be any better. And it is an amazing movie. So we will be talking all about that, and maybe peace out now if you haven't seen it yet. That's our recommendation. You should watch Mobile Suit Gundam Hathaway's Flash. It's very good. Now we can dive into the deep end. Sean, do you have, I mean, the history is this movie just came out, but do you have anything you want to tell us in our normal Gundam history lesson?
Yeah, I guess like a little bit. I mean, you covered a little bit of it at the top of the podcast. I mean, where it comes from is it is an adaptation of a series of 3 light novels written by Tomino in 89 and 90. A light novel, for context, is just like a phrase in Japan that is used for what is generally kind of like young adult literature. But it's like they're smaller novels, which is why they're kind of broken out into volumes like that. So they're little kind of smaller novels that are usually kind of like otaku-based media, that kind of stuff. So it's 3 novels, 89-90. They're written as a sequel to Char's Counterattack. Specifically, they're written as a sequel to Beltorchica's Children, which is a novelization of Char's Counterattack, also written by Tomino, which changes a couple of details. And it's not clear in this movie if they're like being specific about which one they're following or not. The main detail that is different in Beltorchica's Children regarding Hathaway is that in that novel, Hathaway is the one who kills Quest, not Chain, and then in the movie, Hathaway kills Chain, and like that's the big sort of kill he has in that movie. But either way, again, it's not particularly specified in this movie which one they're following up on, or if that's going to be like important to the way that they're depicting it. But Tomino did those novels, and then he later goes on to do F-91, and they're set, being a sequel to Char's Counterattack, it is set in that middle period between Char's Counterattack and F-91. So some of the broader Universal Century mythology about, like, how the space colonies get to where they are in F-91 and in that kind of area of the universe is kind of set up a little bit by some of what you're seeing the Earth Federation doing in the Hathaway stuff. But so these novels had just been around for a long time. They are like really well regarded within the Gundam community. I should say that while I have not read the novels, I did like 3 or 4 years ago when I was watching all the Gundam stuff. I did read a synopsis of the novels because that was well before there was an inkling that these movies would be made. And I don't remember much about them other than the ending, because the ending is very memorable. So I do know I'm obviously not going to talk about it here, but I do know where these movies are ultimately heading. But the novels had been around. They're really well regarded. In a bunch of Gundam games and like Super Robot Wars and stuff like that, they have content from Hathaway's Flash in those. And it's just always been one of those kind of like Crossbone Gundam that people just kind of sit around and go like, well, why the fuck have they not done anything with this? You've got the guy, Yoshiyuki Tomino, who made Gundam, has these original Gundam stories floating out there in novel or manga form. Why not use this as the basis for a new Gundam film or series or whatever? And then they teased it in 2018 and then fully sort of revealed the project in 2019 during one of the 40th anniversary events that they were making this movie. It was originally going to come out in 2020, summer 2020. It did not because of COVID, and it got delayed 3 different times, I think, until eventually it came out last month in Japan. And then it is one of the most successful Gundam movies. It's overtaken Char's Counterattack. It's made over 1 billion yen, so it's not quite up there with the original Gundam trilogy. For context, the highest grossing Gundam movie is Gundam 3 Encounters in Space, which has made 2.3 billion yen. But this movie is doing extremely well. I mean, much better than something like Gundam Narrative or the G-Reco movies. Yeah,
I have the stats here. It's the first Gundam movie since Char's Counterattack to cross 1 billion yen at all. And Narrative Gundam only did 670 million yen in its whole run. So Hathaway's Flash in a couple of weeks has like doubled the last movie. I do think it's also fucking insane and amazing that the highest grossing Gundam movie is one of the original 3 compilation movies from 81. That's wild when you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it goes to show how popular those movies were, because they were like the things that broke Gundam big in the public consciousness. But yeah, like in this movie, I've seen some stuff from like Japanese YouTubers and stuff like that, and stuff I listen to, that people seem to really like it over there as well, as you get from how much money it's making. Yeah, and then just to talk a little bit about the people making the movie. It is directed by a guy named Shuko Murase, and he, along with a lot of the staff on the movie, like the higher up people are generally all like people who have been involved with Gundam for a while, and then a lot of like the individual staff are mostly people who worked on stuff like Unicorn and Gundam The Origin, and kind of moved on from from those projects onto here, and like Gundam Narrative as well. So there's some kind of continuity there. It's all Sunrise people. And Murase, he's got a pretty interesting kind of background where, with Gundam specifically, he's had some pretty prominent roles. He was one of 3 animation directors on Gundam F91, and he also did a lot of key animation on F91. So that's like kind of, I think, a pretty big kind of like medal on his chest or something in the history of Gundam, particularly because animation, it's like F91 has some of the best animation in the history of the franchise. Then he's also done a lot of work on stuff like Gundam Wing. He did a lot of work on Victory Gundam. Again, like a lot of animation direction and key animating on those projects. In terms of non-Gundam stuff, but stuff that he headed up, he's done a couple of really well-regarded series. And unfortunately, I haven't seen any of the series that he has directed. Probably the most well-regarded one that I've been meaning to get around to for a long time, this is a good kind of motivator to finally watch it, is a show called Ergo Proxy. I believe came out in 2006 or 2008 in Japan, and he directed that. It's like a 24 or whatever episode. It's a 2-core long series, and it's very well regarded. I think it's kind of like a dark kind of mystery crime fiction story. And I believe it's streaming on Funimation, because I was looking at it the other day and I was like, I should probably watch this now, because the direction in this movie is extremely good. So I want to see other stuff that this guy has done. Other notable people working on it, it's always a pleasure to look up the staff of something and see this man's name pop up. The storyboards were done by 2 people, one of them being the director Murase, and the other storyboard artist for this movie was Shinichiro Watanabe, who people would best know as the creator of Cowboy Bebop, Samurai Champloo, that stuff. He also did storyboarding on 0083, Stardust Memory, so that's his other like major Gundam credit he's done.
I had no idea about that. I knew he worked on 0083. I honestly didn't know he was doing much anymore. That's amazing. That's awesome.
Yeah. So that was, I had no idea either until I looked up and I'm like, wait, what? Shinichiro Watanabe, and yep, he's one of the storyboard artists. And then a returning veteran from Unicorn Gundam that does some amazing work here also is the composer is Hiroyuki Sawano, one of like the big anime composers in Japan, who he did Unicorn Gundam and Narrative Gundam. He has also done series like Kill la Kill, Attack on Titan, Noah Zero, like just a bunch of stuff. And his
he needs no introduction. He's big.
Yeah, his soundtracks are always amazing, and I think this might legitimately be my favorite soundtrack he's done. I think it is just so incredibly good. And yeah, and then like the rest of the staff are just like really kind of veteran Sunrise people. Again, a lot of crossover from what I was looking at from Unicorn Gundam and Gundam the Origin, which makes sense because those are, you know, OVA kind of big budget, big sized projects. But this is very much not just like an OVA that is being played in movie theaters. Hathaway's Flash is very much, this is a movie. Like, it is, I think, a pretty notable step up in quality from the animation perspective from stuff like Unicorn, The Origin, and Gundam Narrative, which is all very good, but it's not quite like movie good. This is like, you know, Mugen Train, like movie. This is like really, really high quality, like top class animation. I think this is the best animation we have seen in the Gundam franchise since Char's Counterattack and F91, which is something I very much appreciated watching this film.
Yeah, it's very good, and again, because this one is more sort of modest in some of its ambitions, you can only imagine what the sequels, where I suspect that the story gets more heated, are going to be able to do. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's an incredible thing. So yeah, that's really cool to hear about the whole staff. I love all of that, and yeah, it's a cool project. And it's also like Tomino did not work on this himself at all, but like the script is basically him. Like, it's a very close adaptation of the book. You can read an English fan translation of book 1 at Zeonic translations, and if you go there and look at it, like it's close to word for word at times. Like, it's a very, very close adaptation of the light novel. And so, like, this is kind of about as close as we're going to get right now to a new Tomino Gundam thing, you know? It's old from his perspective because he wrote it 30 years ago, but it is basically his script, and so it definitely has that Tomino flavor to it.
Yes, and I think that was one of the things watching the movie that I was most pleased with, is that, I mean, you can just feel it right away, where Tomino has such a particular style of character writing and dialogue, and you get it, and it's so rich, and it's like immediately you hear the conversations, and it's just like nobody writes Gundam the way that Tomino does, because nobody writes anime the way that he does. And so yes, just pulling lines of dialogue, and there's just like a lot of great Gundam-isms. I think Amuro's line in the movie, there's one kind of ghostly line he gets, is like an all-time great. I know it's like they kind of pulled that line from somewhere else in the novels I've heard, but it is the
so it's in
structure.
I looked it up. It's the exact same place in the novel when like Hathaway is doing the same thing, but it's something Hathaway thinks to himself in like internal monologue, not something like, there's not an Amuro apparition there.
Yes, but the way that line is written is like that. It's such a Tomino line. Also in that scene, just as I'm thinking about the Tomino writing, it has like the most Tomino line in the most simple way is when Hathaway goes, "Damn you, gravity, Juryokume!" Like, it's like right up there for me with like at the end of Turn 8 Gundam, yelling Harry Ord going, "Universe!" It's just this. There's this such an idiosyncratic way, like, approach that Tomino has to writing, where there's like always like feels like there's a dozen different levels at which dialogue is working on, and you're always like kind of trying to dig away at it to sort of piece together what is this character's motivation, what are they feeling, why are they saying this, what is going on. And the ability of this movie to capture that quality, I think, is hugely impressive, because I don't think it's something you could do just because you have his dialogue.
Exactly, yes.
It's something you have to design the entire project around the direction and stuff like that to capture that feel. And that's why, one of the reasons why I think it was smart of them to get a Gundam veteran who has worked closely on Tomino on like 3 or 4 different Gundam series back in the day, to direct this, because I feel like, while it's not exactly the way that Tomino would direct it, Murase definitely is like, you can feel there's like a different directorial touch there. There's a deft enough hand at being able to capture the way that Tomino portrays characterization through that direction as well, that I think allows that writing to be as effective as it is. And so it is, for me, you know, I think for any Gundam fan who is just a big fan specifically of Tomino-style Gundam and that kind of classic stuff, like, this feels like a dream come true. It is such a, they just like captured the heart and spirit of that kind of Gundam in a way that you would just, I figured that G-Reco would be the last time we got that. Like, I'm not necessarily expecting that Tomino is going to direct another Gundam movie or series. He's currently working on the G-Reco compilation movies, but those are compilation movies. It's the same story and a lot of the same content, just sort of broken up in different ways. So this just feels like this weird, like, gift from nowhere. That you get this Tomino Gundam, and then also you get it from one of his novels. So it also gets to be, like, 80% just dialogue. So it's even just like you get like the pacing feels more like I think what Tomino typically wanted to do with Gundam stuff and never was able to do because there are so many demands on episodes and mobile suits and fights and blah 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 blah. He's talked about that he wished that there was less action in Char's Counterattack and he could have had more dialogue scenes, and that his favorite scenes of those movies are the dialogue sequences as well as it is, I think, for most people. Even when it's the action, the memorable part of the action are the moments where characters can talk during the fights. And this just feels like, because it's based on one of his novels, some of those concerns are stripped away. So you just get to have this whole long stretch of the movie where you're just having these characters interact and talk to each other, and you just get this hardcore, like, Tomino character writing just injected into your veins, and it's so fucking good.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always kind of loath to break out this term, but it's true for this. This is an adult Gundam. Like, this is a... Not in the sense of, like, there's a bunch of sex and violence and stuff you can't do on TV. It's adult in the sense that it is mature in how it kind of, like, expects you to use your time and attention, right? Mm-hmm. In that it is slow-paced. It is asking you to, like, read between a lot of lines, because a lot of what characters say is kind of very calibrated to be a partial truth, or like they're revealing something through these words. What are they talking about? Like Hathaway's motivations are never specifically spelled out for you in 90 minutes of this movie. Yeah. And it is a lot of, like, through his interactions with others, through small bits of interior dialogue or monologue, you will piece it together, but it is asking you to be very, like, present in the story with it, and that's what makes it feel very adult, very like one of his novels. I've read the original 3 Gundam novels, and it's got a very similar quality to some of the stuff in there. When I went to look at the fan translation of the Hathaway novel, it's just, his voice is so strong that even in a mildly clumsy fan translation, it just comes through immediately, Yeah, so I agree with everything you said, and really this movie should be seen, I think, in the Tomino canon, like with the other stuff. Even if he didn't literally direct this, it's very clearly part of that sort of overall, like, story body of work. So, and hey, we couldn't ask for anything more than that, right, Sean?
Yeah, no, again, it is this thing that it's I've only been a Gundam fan for 5 or 6 years at this point, but within that time, it is this and Crossbone Gundam have always been those pieces of Gundam that are out there that are like,
Please
feel
make
like
this.
Yeah, like, it just feels like, particularly, at this point, I'm probably good enough at Japanese that I could just read the original Hathaway's Flash novels if I wanted to, although it would take me a long time, because reading novels is a lot harder than reading manga. But, like, particularly being a fan who's not Japanese, like, it's just always, like, kind of out of your reach, this, like, mythical thing that's like, oh my god, he wrote these things, and it's a sequel to Char's Counterattack, or it's a sequel to F91. And so, yeah, to be able to get this, and then also to just have it come out, I wish it was in theaters, because especially now having seen it, holy shit, this would be a movie that play incredibly well in theaters. But, like, being able to get it a month after it came out in Japan, and not have to wait, like, a year to get it, that also is something that adds to the fact of just, like, it just feels like you're dreaming almost as a Gundam fan. That's, like, you just wouldn't imagine that this would have been able to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Although, on that note, I will just say, I hope for the next one, Netflix improves their stream of this, because for whatever reason, the stream is garbage for this movie. It is compressed to hell. Like, to a degree that Netflix usually has... I don't usually have to worry about Netflix streaming quality. It's very good. On Thursday night when I watched it, I thought, well, maybe it's kind of over-compressed right now because so many people are watching the movie. It's opening night, that kind of thing. But Saturday night, it was the same way. And I've found online a rip of the Blu-ray in Japan, because if you don't know, they're selling the Blu-ray in movie theaters if you go to see the movie. It's not you can't, like, get it on Amazon Japan or something yet. I'm sure they will have a general release version, but they have a limited release in theaters. So there is a Blu-ray rip out there, and it does look much better. Like, part of it is the Blu-ray, and I think the master video is a little darker. And some fans have complained about that being like they can't see the final fight, and I don't think that's necessarily true. It might be something in your setup, but it does seem like the Netflix version sort of is one, way too compressed, and then is artificially brightened in some places that leads to some of these video problems. So, I mean, I'm glad we have it, and it's very easy to watch it on Netflix, and it didn't ruin my enjoyment or anything, but it is a really compressed stream, and I do look forward to owning the Blu-ray of this at some point, because it deserves it. It's a fucking gorgeous movie.
Yeah, this is definitely a movie that you watch. Same with like Mugen Train, that you watch and you're like, this is something you want to own on physical media to have it in like the highest quality possible, because it warrants, like the quality of what you're seeing warrants you seeing it in the best way you can.
Well, since we're talking about it, you just want to talk about the animation a little bit, because it is so good. I think for me there were a couple things that stood out. The background work. I don't know if Gundam has ever had backgrounds this like lush and detailed and colorful and like full of life. It honestly reminded me of a lot of stuff in Kimetsu no Yaiba, in Mugen Train, like those UFO table, like hyper detailed backgrounds. You get a lot of that here, and because so much of this movie is about physical space, and it is about this. They're in Australia in this movie, right?
No, I think they're they're like going to go to Australia. Okay. I forget where they are, but yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So, but they're in it kind of looked like either Australia or South Africa or something to me. But they're in a big city on a coast. And, like, it is a city with, like, you know, these high highs for the rich and very low lows for the poor. And it is sort of, so there's a class argument just kind of embedded in the aesthetics of the thing. And so much of it is about the characters in that space, inhabiting it, talking through things. That background stuff, especially on a second viewing, just really was, like, really striking to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think just generally speaking, between this movie and the other movie it made me think of is Dragon Ball Super Broly. I think we're really at a place where we're seeing a lot of the kind of stylistic and aesthetic innovations that Ufotable made in the late 2000s around Kadano Kyokai in their Fate stuff is really like spreading out wider in the industry. And then obviously like Kimetsu no Yaiba being on this really big stage, but Kimetsu no Yaiba was coming out while this movie was in production, so that wouldn't have been a direct influence. But you're getting that like blend of really high quality 2D digital animation with 3D backgrounds and 3D camera elements and things like that. Because this movie does use balance some like 3D model stuff, sometimes for characters, sometimes for mobile suits, but it's not like exclusively 3D for mobile suits the way that some recent Gundam stuff has done. It is, I think, very smart in how it's balancing the 3D CG stuff in the 2D and making them integrate really powerfully. And then particularly then in the action sequences, allows them to do stuff with the camera movements that would not have been possible on traditional 2D animation. And so I feel like this movie is bringing that kind of general like Ufotable style and approach that we've seen kind of spread out to other studios. It's really kind of bringing it home here to Gundam also. And yes, like that leads to these incredibly gorgeous backgrounds. I think the character animation is so top notch. There's so much great work done in small facial expressions.
Well, that's the next thing. Sorry.
Yeah, because it's so much of the movie being dialogue focused. So much about it is little character pieces that you need to capture in their kind of physicality, the way they walk, the way they carry themselves, and the way they express themselves on their face. It's a really important part of the film, and they capture that with such subtlety so effectively.
Well, yeah, that was the next thing I was going to say, is because most of the movie is not big mobile suit battles, where you see the money in the animation is those backgrounds, and then just the number of like frames and the amount of detail in basic character movement. The kind of stuff that like is very easy to cut corners on TV, but even in movies, like, often does not get that much. But, like, in this movie, it kind of needs it, because it is so much about these dialogues and these small changes in a person's face, and the work the animators do in realizing all of that. Like, what it made me think of is some of Isao Takahata's movies, and what he does with faces, and, like, his commitment to sort of, like, the amount of, like, some of his, like, 90s stuff, like Only Yesterday, Omoide Poro Poro, or Pompoko, or some stuff like that, where, like, you have, like, the just amount of, like, facial detail going on is almost, like, uncanny in a good way at times. It's one of the only Gundam things where the lip syncing is really tight.
Yes.
Because in most anime, not just Gundam, most anime, they don't give a shit about the lip syncing, and it's why I'm always confused why dubs care so much about it, because the original doesn't. But like this one, it's like almost to the degree I wouldn't be surprised if they pre-recorded. I'd be kind of curious about that because it's so tight on like the faces and everything. It is really extraordinarily good character animation.
Yeah, it's just the level of thought and care that goes into animating the characters and make them express what they're feeling is really remarkable. And then the other piece of the animation is those fight scenes are just jaw-dropping. And it is, part of it is like the quality of the animation, but the other part of it is like the quality of the overall production, of like the direction and the creativity of particularly all the shots they do that are set within the cockpits, and you have those great Zeta on like full 3D cockpits that like you see the whole surrounding within the cockpit, and all the shots that are in there from a pilot's perspective I just think are so incredible. And that's the kind of stuff where it's like that would just not be feasible on like traditional hand-drawn 2D animation. Like there's too much going on, the camera movements are so complicated. But the sense of weight and perspective and depth in the image, because these things are so huge and they're moved so quickly and they're so far away from each other, that anytime you have any of that in those mobile suit fights, that's like the kind of thing that I just have never seen a mecha anything approach direction quite that way. And it really makes you, it makes you feel like you're in the action. It really like puts you there and makes you feel like you are getting thrown about as these massive chunks of metal are shooting across the sky and colliding into each other and crashing into buildings or diving into the sea. It's the whole project of how they handled the action in this movie, I just think is like second to none. I found it just incredible.
Yeah, because so we have not reviewed Gundam The Origin yet, but we have both seen it, and that one uses mostly 3D mobile suits, and sometimes to great effect. The Battle of Loom is phenomenal, and I don't know how else you would do it. They very much use 3D space, but this movie goes beyond. And I agree with you, Sean. The stuff that like struck me most was the in the cockpit stuff, because it was so striking to me when I went back, because I rewatched Char's Counterattack on Wednesday in preparation for this, and I just was realized again, like, oh man, I love the 360-degree cockpits, and like not all of AU Gundam does that,
Yeah.
And a lot of AU Gundam in fact doesn't do that at all, and like goes back to kind of like military style cockpits. And like I just started watching Gundam Age, which is going to be our next review, and that one very much is like these tight cockpits with like a little tiny window to see outside. And no, I don't want any of that. I want my 360-degree cockpit, which is fucking crazy, and I love it because you can do such cool visually dynamic stuff with it. But what we've never seen is the 360-degree cockpit with a dynamic 3D camera, and it is wild. It is wild, Sean. There's that shot where you have Galman, the Kenjiro Tsuda character, Seto Kaiba himself, now in Gundam, yay, who he jumps down from Lane Ames' suit down to Hathaway's, and that shot of him coming into the cockpit and then coming in behind Hathaway, and then when Hathaway has his line, it's like, I'm going to finish this in one move, and he says, you go, Mafty, and he like sits behind him, and he's like getting in the like seat while he's saying that, and just this movement of these two people in this space, and then the camera moving around in such a way that also makes you feel like the kind of judder of it because they're in a giant flying suit. It's incredible, and definitely is like the triumphant return of 3D cockpits. It's so good.
Yes, like that I think is the shot specifically I think of because it's not just, you can, the 3D cockpit allows you to like see the environment and stuff, which allows you to do a lot of cool shots, but then it's also the consciousness of the cockpit like image turns off and then the door opens up, and you get that sense of depth as you're like sitting from Hathaway's POV looking up out of the cockpit at this like dot in the sky who is Galman falling towards you, and you feel like not just how far away Galman is, but like how far away you, the pilot / Hathaway, are from like the outer edge of the Gundam, like all the layers of metal between your cockpit and the outside. Like that sense of depth to the imagery is so tangible. And I think that's like the thing that they get with the mobile suit animation, is that everything feels real and like you could like touch it, because of the way it's directed and animated. It gives everything the sense of depth and weight I've just never seen any mecha thing quite handle it this way, and it's just amazing.
But it all blends really well too. It's not 100% seamless, but it is so much closer to seamless than like Gundam the Origin, which I think is pretty like jarring when you go from like the normal just 2D cell animation to then you'll have a big 3D Gundam come in that just looks like CGI. Like, they are 3D, but it's exactly what you're talking about, that kind of UFO table tradition of finding ways to utilize 3D elements in 3D space while keeping an overall aesthetic. And this movie does that very, very well, and really does feel kind of like you're looking at the future of Gundam and how it's doing that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's so fucking good. Again, it's like just watching this whole movie just feels like you're just getting a treat. Like, it's just, particularly again, if you're an old school Gundam fan that likes like the Tomino stuff, it's just this whole thing is like, is it my birthday? Did my birthday come early? Because it feels like it's a present.
Yeah, and I think most people will agree that visually, like, the big standout of the movie is the middle sequence where they are escaping from the hotel, and you have Gauman and the others from MAFD coming down and firing, and there's so many, like, you were talking about the scene in the cockpit and like how that just is such a perception altering moment, you know, for a mobile suit viewer. The ones for me are just Gauman flying around the city, like when he comes off of like the like ship that they're all on, and just that sense of like weight in the sky, and like you see it from his point of view in the cockpit, and and there's just that little bit of it's on the TV shows, it's always pretty steady, the pilots, because you can't do too much with that. But like here, it's like you get that sense of like moving around in space, like you're almost in a flight sim or something, and then his targeting computer showing the hotels off in the distance and the big high rises that he's targeting, and just that sense of weight and movement through the air. And then when you get down on the ground and you have Hathaway and Gigi running around, and it is kind of like that F-91 opening sequence where you have all the mobile suits from a human scale perspective, and you have stuff like the sparks coming off a mobile suit, like melting street poles and stuff like that. And it all leads to, I think, the best image in the movie, and I think one of the best images in the history of Gundam, which is Hathaway holding Gigi in front of Gauman's suit that is shooting out sparks like it's fireworks. And that is our art on this episode, if you want to look at that. That is like one of the great images Gundam has ever produced, to my mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's so good they used it on like one of the posters. It's like it's an iconic image from the movie for sure. But yeah, like just like sticking with, since we're here with that middle sequence, because that is especially if you're talking about like the action stuff, that is the standout sequence of the movie to me, because it is like one thing it reminded me of is the 2014 Godzilla movie, like the commitment to having cameras be in places that make sense for most of it, particularly when you're on the ground, and it's that commitment to the ground level perspective that gives weight and depth to everything. But like there's so many smart things they do in that sequence to give you that powerful perspective. One thing is, I think, the way that the mobile suits, their like size compared to the buildings around them, there's a lot of like care, I think, of that as you're moving away from the skyscrapers, the mobile suits feel bigger and bigger because everything else around them is smaller. So that like sense of when they're in the middle of the city next to the skyscrapers are huge. They're way, 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 way bigger than the mobile suits. But that in one way gives you that sense of perspective on this is how big a mobile suit is like it's, 3 or 4 stories tall. And then once you get deeper in, like, to the park and stuff like that, now the mobile suit is the biggest thing in the image. And everybody at, like, the feet of the mobile suit running around, dodging sparks, dodging bullet casings. There's that, I think, just incredible fucking shot where early on in the fight, Gauman gets hit, and because he gets hit, his mobile suit drops his beam rifle, and then the camera goes and follows it to the ground as it smashes into the ground and crushes a car right by where Hathaway is. And that's where you kind of rejoin Hathaway and Gigi on the ground. And that sense of, the beam rifle is like 2 or 3 stories tall on its own. Like, it's enough to smash everything around it. Them in the building, like, taking cover, and then the wall behind them starts cracking, and the camera pulls out, and you see that one of the mobile suits has landed on top of the building, and the building is collapsing underneath its weight. Just all of those little tiny pieces of detail and attention to detail, that is very much feels like. And again, Munase himself was an animation director and a key animator on F91. I'd be very curious to know if he worked specifically on that first act sequence, because it feels like a successor to the opening of F91, where you get a bullet casing flying off and hitting someone in the head and killing them in one hit. This whole sequence has that feel to it.
Absolutely. But, like, it also has the attention to character animation is also so important here, because all of the stuff with Hathaway and Gigi in this sequence, where she is, like, almost catatonic at places because, like, as self-assured in everything she is, she has never seen this, you know?
Yeah.
And, I mean, even Hathaway is pretty freaked the fuck out by it, because he hasn't been on the ground level for this either, really. But he is pulling her through all of this, and there is such phenomenal attention to character detail in the midst of this sequence, and that's like a level of not that the F-91 character animation, it's some of the best character animation in the whole franchise, but I feel like this one-ups it to a certain degree, and like, because also this is just focusing on, because the F-91 sequence is a whole city, and it's a big group of characters, and it's a lot of personalities we don't know yet. This is two people we've spent the whole movie with, and this sequence is building their character as much as any dialogue scene, you know? And I think that is part of what makes it feel so visceral and like weirdly intimate. It feels intimate as a sequence because the touch between them is so important. Like that shot I was talking about, that's one of my favorite Gundam shots ever, with the sparks as fireworks. On either side of that are close-ups where you have Gigi's hand on the back of Hathaway because she's like wrapped around him, and she starts moving her hand on his back like she's comforting him, but really she's comforting herself by just like reaching out and touching something physical. And it is this beautiful little motion. And then once the sparks start and Hathaway's looking up at Galman and his mobile suit being defeated, Hathaway returns it and starts doing it on her back. And it's just little details like that that just take your breath away and make this feel like, for all of the bombast and the scale of it, it is also just like breathtakingly intimate, which also I think is, that's why I kind of like that Godzilla comparison you just made, because I think that's something Gareth Edwards goes for in that movie. But you can do it even more in animation, and boy, God, they do. Yeah,
like one detail there that I really like is that once Gigi like kind of just like loses control and can't like walk really anymore because she's going semi-catatonic, Hathaway is like grabbing her and pulling her like two arms kind of below her stomach, almost like a Hyman maneuver kind of position, and dragging her through the street. And the way that the actress who did Reina like gives these like very shocked like gasps, like someone getting punched in the stomach, because she's getting dragged forcibly through the street by her stomach, basically. And like there is, like you say, like there's a sense of attention to character detail and little animations and little pieces like that where you can feel like you're with them, because of the attention shown with the direction and the animation on those kinds of details that make you like with the characters. And because when we say, you know, we're complimenting the quality of animation, with that is the direction and the choice of like how to show it and what to show, not just the quality in which you show it. And both of them are at such like, you know, breaking the scale. It's like 11 out of 10 quality, like some of the best stuff you've seen when they're both working on that register. It just makes like, I think, what is going to continue to be like an all-time great classic moment in like scene in Gundam history that will stand up with the opening of F-91 or the climax of Char's Counterattack or some of the standout moments from the TV shows like the Colony Drop and Double Zeta and stuff like that. Like this to me is going to be one of those go-to in my head when I think about a great sequence in Gundam history that defines what I like about this franchise. That is going to be one of the ones that pops up.
Oh, totally, 100%. And it really is the direction and the storyboarding and all of that. Because you can have all the animation money you want in the world, and this doesn't. Like, it's a much bigger budget Gundam project than we tend to see, but this does not have, like, the heft of Mugen Train or something behind it to that degree, right? And it doesn't need to. It's not doing that much in terms of, like, the number of things going on screen. But it really comes down to, like, it is, like, you know, like, American animated movies have budgets 30 times the size of this, right? And I'm not exaggerating. If this movie cost 10 to 20 million, you know, the American movie 30 times that, I'm probably right. It's like, so you have crazy budgets, and there's no American CGI animated movie that's anywhere fucking near what they're doing here. Yeah. And it's because they don't have that kind of, like, direction and just sheer attention to these things, and that just raw like experience and intelligence behind it that you have here. It's incredible stuff. Like you can tell this is a veteran director who's been doing this. I mean, F-91 is an old movie. That's older than either of us. So yeah, it's it's an incredible amount of experience being brought to bear here. The Watanabe connection does not surprise me now that you say it, because it's like, well, yeah, it makes sense as someone who's been storyboarding for decades did the storyboards here, you know? It's incredible. This is not a movie that got handed to the young talent, which sometimes is awesome because you get new people proving themselves. But you can just feel kind of the years of experience.
Yeah, and I was watching the other night the Washiyagana YouTube channel, which has Nakamura Yuichi, the voice of Mr. Bushido, on it, and they were talking about the movie because they had seen it. And I don't remember which project it is, but Nakamura Yuichi has worked with Murase on some anime series, and he was talking a little bit about that experience, and that Murase, from his perspective, is very much like a perfectionist sort of director that, like, particularly like the way he works with actors is like he really wants actors to sort of like give it their all and like give a bunch of different takes and really play with the whole experience. And then when he's working on the animation, like he's very exacting on what he wants. And I feel like you can feel that there's so much detail and so much specificity to what he's looking for as a director that it comes across so powerfully, particularly in that middle sequence.
Absolutely. Well, we've lavished a lot of praise on the animation, and because of all that, we haven't even really talked about the story of this movie. So should we go there?
Yeah, let's go there. So the story, I'm with you, Jonathan. That I was kind of with what you said about the first time you watched it, but I was kind of surprised by because even though I knew a lot of the basics around the background of what Hathaway's Flash is, I don't think I ever realized the way in which it starts is so much in the middle. Like, I knew that Hathaway becomes Mafti, Navue Aaron, and he's like a terrorist or whatever, and he's fighting against the Earth Federation to try to convince people to go into space. Like, I knew that was the premise of Hathaway's Flash. But in my head, I always assumed that the story was started from Hathaway is Hathaway, and he's sad and alone and traumatized from the end of Char's counterattack, and then he ends up as a member of this group, and then he becomes your Gundam boy or whatever, basically. But it was like a much darker version of that. Instead of what the movie is it starts very much in medias res, and I don't think you realize at first just how much in medias res you are until a little bit deeper into the movie, that Hathaway is not only already a member of Mafti Navue Aaron, but like one of, if not the like top member. At the very least, he is like taking the name of Mafti for himself. Like, we don't know if there's other people above that on the rung, which Kenneth kind of suspects. But he's there, he's on this plane. And then you have two other characters, Gigi and Kenneth. And the whole movie is basically about those three characters. And the movie is sort of structured around... I kind of like feel like how I structure the movie in my head is the 3-act structure is Act 1 is about these three characters coming together. Act 2 is about what do these three characters do and like communicate with each other once they're together. And then the third act is about how do these three characters split apart. And it's very much a 3-hand story. Like, all three of them are, I think, like basically co-leads, with Hathaway being the protagonist. And that is what I think lends the movie its like depth of characterization, is that it's not really about like a love triangle. There's like a little bit of that at play, but it's not really what it is. It's just about these three people who all are kind of a little bit deceptive. They all have multiple sides of themselves. They all have things that they're hiding about who they are. But they all have different kind of things in common, and they all have this kind of like natural bond of chemistry and friendship that they develop at the end of that hijacking sequence. And it's about them trying to navigate those lives, while in the background, one of them, Kenneth, is not just an officer of the Earth Federation, but is the captain that is taking over the Kimberly squad, which is the squad that's sort of leading the charge against Mafti. The other one is one of the main people from Mafti, and then Gigi is kind of caught in the middle as this mysterious girl who is your like new type lady, right? She's very much like built in the image of Quest Pariah, but also seems to have a lot more going on with her. And I just think that structure and just focusing on the dialogue and the interactions between these three characters is such a bold feeling, like really different approach for a Gundam story.
Absolutely, and I think that's a really good summary of what it's doing, and that's what makes it feel so different, because I definitely felt a little thrown for a loop too. And I knew even less about this story. So all I knew about the Hathaway's Flash story is that he gets involved in a terrorist group, And I do know the ending because it's infamous.
Yeah, it's kind of if you even vaguely hear the ending, there's no way you will ever forget the ending. Like, I'm so curious like how you, because I forget how you get there, and I'm curious how they'll do it. But yes, the ending of the movie is extremely infamous. Even like that's another thing from that Nakamura Yuji video is that he said is like, yeah, once you hear the ending, you never forget. Like I heard the ending happened in like a game he played, and he's thought about that ending since he played that game because it is very like bold and interesting.
So anyway, but I did not even know the detail that Hathaway was Mafty. I didn't know that. So like that actually made the movie even more fun for me because it starts out and he's on the plane, and I had the same assumption you did, Sean, that this would be like, how does Hathaway join the terrorists? And it's not. He's already Mafty. And so when Gigi says that to him at like the 20-minute mark, I didn't know that yet. I was very much trying to figure out his motivations, and even then, the movie doesn't really confirm it for you until about a half hour in when he's talking to other people from his team.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of ambiguity there, and I think that's very intentional. Like, I actually think if you go in sort of tabula rasa, you'll see in Tomino's story structure, it's not starting with Hathaway going to himself, I am Mafty, and today I'm on a plane. Like, it is very much kind of guiding you in there very gently into this dense world you're in now. And so the movie is about these three characters, and it is about... And it's not about these three characters necessarily doing anything all that significant. The big thing that happens in this movie is that Hathaway goes and gets himself a Gundam.
Yes.
Right? Like, that's ultimately the big thing he achieves at the end, and Kenneth sort of susses him out. But other than that, it is mostly just world building and character detail and that kind of stuff. And I think the first time I watched the movie, I thought it was maybe a little loose, and I thought it felt very first acty in that it's all character introductions and stuff. But when I watched it a second time, it's much tighter than I thought. It is very focused, as you say, on that triptych of characters, and it really does trace an arc. I don't know if you could exactly map it onto like a Hollywood 3-act structure, but it does have a clear, like, developmental arc, as you say, in these sort of like 3 phases at least. Like the 3 half hours are fairly distinct in the 90-minute movie. And within there, the way those relationships develop and that the characters are somewhat subtly but very palpably in different places at the end of the movie and have gone on something of a journey, even if in terms of absolute plot distance very little has happened, is what makes it such an extraordinary Gundam movie. And like, specifically as Gundam, because Gundam stuff is generally pretty plot heavy. Like, Char's Counterattack has a whole lot of plot in those 2 hours. F91 has a whole TV series in it. Awakening of the Trailblazer. It's easy to imagine the 13-episode season version of Awakening of the Trailblazer. This is very small, and I think that's part of what makes it work so well. It is a feature, not a bug, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And when I was saying at the top of the conversation that I felt like a little bit of messiness in the third act, like I think mainly what I mean is you have this other character, Lane, who is the Gundam boy, right? He's the pilot of the Penelope. Who that's like the final confrontation in the movie is Hathaway fighting Lane, and that's the one area where it feels like, you know, if this was its own movie and it wasn't the first movie of a trilogy, you would really want that conversation to be more directly between Kenneth and Hathaway than it is, where it's kind of like separated between them by this young Gundam boy. But obviously that's because Lane is going to be a more important character in the subsequent bits, and Kenneth and Hathaway's relationship will develop and stuff like that. So
by the way,
sorry.
I was just gonna say, here's how you know this is a Tomino thing: Kenneth Slegg, Gigi Andalusia, Lane Aim, and a Gundam called Penelope.
Yes.
That could not be more Tomino if you tried. He is a god of names, and I love him.
Yes, and then you can't forget the best name, which it's easy to forget because you hear it so much because it's the name of the fucking movie, but Hathaway Noa, what a great name. It's such a good name. Like, I just hope that at some point we get a little scene with his sister Chaemin, so we get Chaemin Noa and Hathaway Noa together, because they are two of, like, I think the most underrated names in Gundam, because they're relatively minor characters, particularly before this, for Hathaway. But yes, Hathaway, What a good fucking name. It's also just a name that you love to hear Japanese voice actors say.
Yes.
Because it's got this very kind of flighty quality to it when you have more of that S sound for the TH. It's just...
It
so
kind of
good.
makes you whisper it, you know?
Yes.
Like, characters often say it in, like, hushed tones, Hathaway, because that's what it kind of guides your mouth to say. And yes, it's amazing and perfect.
Yeah, absolutely. Great names. And Lane Aim also, you know, just he's our little Gundam boy that we only see a little bit in this movie, but it's a very good name.
I already like him. I love that his Gundam is named Penelope. It's fucking great. Yeah. So, do you want to break down and just talk about the characters as we sometimes do? This one will be relatively easy. There's three.
Yes, yeah. There's really three major characters to talk about because there are a bunch of like smaller people, like roles around the edge that you get the sense are going to be more important later because there's a whole group of mafty people that you generally only get like a little bit with. The most notable one in this movie is Gauman, by Kenjiro Tsuda. He's fun.
He's so good.
Yes.
But it is a small part, right?
Yes,
obviously.
Yeah. But let's talk about our main boy here, Hathaway Noa, who is played by an actor I like a lot. He's played by Ono Kensho, who, if you watched any of those Shadow Game videos from Hana Inatsuki's YouTube channel that we talked about for the Kimetsu no Yaiba videos, which are videos on his channel where three different voice actors get together and they play board games, the best one being Uno, but pretend that they're like Yu-Gi-Oh! He is one of those three actors on those videos.
I knew it. Okay, I was thinking about this the whole time. Like, I knew the voice, and I'm like, what do I know that voice from? And I'm sure I know it from multiple things. But yes, I watched the Uno thing with my brother a couple weeks ago, and just about asphyxiated myself laughing. And Ono, of course, he's in that. He's so good in that.
Yes,
yeah.
Because when he's doing Uno, his name's not Ono Kensho, it's Uno Kensho.
Uno Kensho. Yes, exactly. It's
that because I remember vividly watching that video for the first time, and that's like one of the first things because it's them introducing themselves, and he says that, and I was like, well, I'm going to subscribe to this YouTube channel because that is such a good fucking gag. But yeah, Ono Kensho's a great young actor. He's actually a child actor. One thing that's interesting is that he got like his really big break was not in anime. He was the dub artist for Harry Potter in the Harry Potter film series. Which he's the same age as Daniel Radcliffe, so kind of they did the same thing where he was a kid when those movies came out. He's like 1 or 2 years older than we are, and then he aged up as he voiced that character, and then continues to voice the character in games and stuff like that.
he's the exact same age as Daniel Radcliffe, like 2 months apart.
Yes.
And he plays a lot of these kinds of characters. So he was the protagonist of Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc V. He's been in other stuff like that where he plays young people kind of growing up. And we should also say this is a recast. This is not Hathaway's like historic actor in Gundam, but I think you listen to Ono here for 5 minutes and you're like, yep, that's a really good casting.
Yeah, because the actor who played Hathaway in Char's Counterattack, Nozomu Sasaki, like he played Hathaway in like some of the games and stuff like that. But I think it was the right choice, I think, to go for a fresh casting for this movie. Like partially just for like age reasons. Like Hathaway is supposed to be like 25 in this movie, so Ono Kensho is like around the right age. He's like about 30 or so, I guess. But yeah, the other big thing I do want to shout out with him also in recent years, I think he just fucking knocked out of the park, is he is the main JoJo, Giorno Giovanni, in Part 5 of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. So that's the most recent part in the anime. So if people like JoJo, he's Giorno Giovanni. And then also notable in that is one of the other main characters in that is voiced by Junichi Suabe, who's the guy who plays Kenneth's leg. So it's kind of fun that they're kind of back together again, working on a big project like this.
I also want to say Ono Kensho is Diluc in Genshin Impact. Never forget Genshin Impact voices.
Yes,
I love Diluc.
Yes, we've got Diluc in Genshin Impact, and then Gigi is Ganyu Ueda Reina. So you've got, we have our Genshin crew, of course, Kenjiro Tsuda, who's also in Genshin Impact. Eventually, every Japanese actor will be in Genshin Impact. So we'll have to mention
We're getting there
in every episode of this show. But yeah, so Ono Kensho, like a great young actor, been in a bunch of stuff, like very experienced, and I think he just absolutely nails it, because Hathaway, I mean, this is true about all three characters, like they're really complicated roles. I feel like you can feel it when you're watching the movie that this must be like, if you're an actor and like acting is your like passion, this must be like a dream fucking project, because you just get these super, super meaty, complicated characters. You get so much dialogue. Even though like all the COVID stuff was going around with some of the production of the movie, like based on, I watched a video on the Gundam official Gundam channel. It's only in Japanese, but it is an interview that Kono Kensho does. He does one with Ude Reina, who plays Gigi, and he did one with Junichi Suabe, who plays Kenneth, and they kind of talk about their characters and stuff like that. And they made sure that those three actors were always together when they had scenes together, so they always recorded their lines together because it is the heart of the movie. And you just get the sense of them as actors talking to each other about these characters, like how much thought and care and nuance goes into portraying them, because all of them, and in many ways especially Hathaway, have so many different layers to them because their motivations and what they're feeling are so complex and kind of self-contradictory. Because Hathaway's role in this movie is he is scarred by what has happened with Quest and Char and Amuro and all that at the end of Char's counterattack, has been carrying that with him. Even though he is the son of like the Earth Federation's like greatest hero, Bright Noah, he's chosen this path to go against the Earth Federation because he feels, my read of it is like he feels so obligated to live up to the legacy of these people who died at the end of Char's counterattack and in Char's rebellion, specifically Amuro and Char, that he had this one small part in, but that has so much defined his life, whether it was that he killed Quest or that he killed Chainagi. Like either way, like he did something that he can't take back, and he was participant in those events and he saw them firsthand. And so he is trying to live up to this impossible legacy of two men, Amuro and Char, who walked very different paths trying to find the right outcome for humanity, both believing in the same outcome but like in different means to get there, right? That Char wants revolution at whatever cost. Amuro wants to have faith and optimism and hope in humanity and wants to take the long route, hoping and believing that humanity will get there even if he's not being proactive about it. And Hathaway is like trapped in the middle between those two different perspectives, while he is also then trying to hide that that is what he is doing and what he's going through from the people around him, particularly for this movie because he's spending most of the time with Kiki and Kenneth, that he can't reveal really or talk about what it is to be Mafty and all this stuff. And there's so many fucking layers there that like every single line read you feel like has to be so deeply considered, because it has to hit on all these different pieces of what he is willing to show to people, what he is willing to like admit to people, and like what are the things that he can't help himself from hiding and that he ends up showing whether intending it or not. Like there's so much complexity that goes into the role, and at the same time like the character has to, on the face of it, be this very kind of dull everyman, because that's kind of like Hathaway's whole character design, is he's this very plain looking young man. And he needs to be like, Kensho has to play him as very inconspicuous for so much of the movie. And it's just, that role asks for so much. And I just think he fucking knocks it out of the park.
Yes, absolutely. It's a phenomenal performance, and it's a phenomenal character. And you know what performance it specifically reminded me of in anime is one of our favorites to talk about here is Mamoru Miyano, who as Light Yagami in Death Note. It reminded me a lot of that. Not necessarily all the character details, because Hathaway is not a psychopath. Like Light Yagami, they're like very pointedly not a psychopath. Yeah. He has very heavy emotions. But it does have that sense of like these different layers of a person that you are holding, and like at the center is something very different than what's in the outside. And a lot of like, particularly early on where he's trying to walk this line of not getting caught after the stuff on the plane, it reminded me of that a little bit. But man, it's such a good performance, and it is such a fascinating character, and I think it's such a interesting discussion of what are his motivations here. And I think it is such a smart choice by Tomino to start this story at a point where we are past those choices. Yeah. He is Mafty. He's on this path. He could go back, but it would be very hard at this point. He is on the warpath. And so we're not following that A to B progression. We are very much in the middle of it, and the character is a bit of a mystery to us. And part of the point of this movie is untangling that character mystery a little bit, And I think you hit on it there, of that part of it is this it's, I think, what you said of like wanting to live up to those legacies of this larger than life characters that he sort of briefly encountered in this war and Char's counterattack. But I think it's also something of trying to make sense of the trauma of it, right? And in that sense, he's an inheritor not just to Char and Amuro, but to like the entire universal century thus far, right? And this entire legacy of space trauma that has happened, and trying to make sense of it. And he has these lines this is in the middle of the movie, right before the raid on the city starts, where he's lying in bed and he's looking at the card that he's been given by the hotel people. And the card is like this Federation bigwig endless wallet card, right? Where you give it, like, the government will pay for anything you put on here because you're special and chosen, and the government is just so corrupt at this point.
They basically just handed him a checkbook that is full of blank checks, and says, like, hey, buy whatever you want.
Yeah, because you're Hathaway Noa. Yeah. You know, you're Bright Noah's kid, right? And Bright Noah is not a corrupt person, but he is part of a system that is increasingly bad. Yeah. So, yes, I assume Captain Bright is in this story at some point, and I am very fascinated to get there. Anyway, but he's looking at that card, which I think is a very potent symbol in the movie, you know? And he says, tell me how to destroy the depths of these mechanisms. We can't all live on Earth together. And a couple lines later, he has a tear rolling down his cheek, and he says, as long as there are exceptions to the rules, people will try to cheat. And I think that couple of lines says so much to me about who he is in this movie, in that he is someone who is trying to process this trauma of these unreconcilable differences into something that is reconcilable. And the path he's found is horrible in one sense, because it is straight up terrorism. It's blowing up buildings and killing innocent people, while also trying to get to the different cabinet ministers that are their real target. And he knows it's terrible, and he says that. But he's looking and he says, I don't know what is the path to tear this fucking thing down, but all I do know is that it can't stand, because it is horrible and unjust, and it is traumatizing. And I think when that tear is rolling down his cheek, I think he's thinking of, read it however you want, it's the Belter Chica's children version, or it's the Char's counterattack version, whatever happened in that war, and that sense of unresolve, in that this problem has to be solved. We can't all live together. Clearly, look at this. And I think that is such a, you can't come to like one definitive conclusion on what his motivations are, because he can't either. And I think it does such a beautiful job at letting you live in that space that's really complex, and like definitely is there in all of Tomino's stuff, and Char's counterattack is about it, but it is often presented as these like polar opposites, you know, of Char and Amuro, and a dialogue between them, and some kind of dialectic. But here that dialectic is going on within one person, and that makes it maybe even more fraught and complicated, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think so much of what the movie is it is, as you find out at the end of the movie, like he was on that plane, right, originally because he needed to see the faces of all the cabinet members he was going to kill before he killed them, is the reasoning he gives to himself. And I think it's a thing where you see then that like part of his motivation and like the journey he's on this movie is like, he's trying to cut out his doubts and regrets and those feelings. And I think he wants to believe, I think at the end of the movie, that he has done that in some way. And I think it's kind of, at least to me, it's clear that he hasn't. That he's like thinking like he's like, and I've cut off these like strange relationships I made on that ship. And now I'm going to become,
that to Emeralda,
yeah, I'm going to become Mafty Nevui Aaron. He almost like in a weird, like circular way ends up almost quoting a scene from Double O Gundam of the Cessna FSA thing of him seeing Lock-on Stratos, and Stratos saying, I can't change, so you have to change for me. And he has this line where it's like, quest, like, I will change, I will become Mavui Nafti Aaron, and he kind of, the way he phrases it is very similar. But it's like him trying to convince himself that he's absolutely right, and trying to cut out all these doubts he has. And I think that motivation is so fascinating. And to that middle scene that you were talking about, that I think is like, that in the end, I think are the two kind of like linchpin scenes for the character, because those are the two only real moments where you get access into directly what he is thinking about that's not related to like navigating a Gundam or like putting his plan together. There's a couple of internal monologues that are related to that, but those two scenes are just him justifying and exploring things within his own mind. And that scene that you were talking about, where he talks about like, how do I destroy like these mechanisms, and we can't all live on Earth together. And then in there, that's where he has the line where he says, if we don't do this, like if we don't fix it, and because the way it's phrased in Japanese like leaves a lot of ambiguity, because he almost starts the sentence in the middle. It's not like directly connected to what he had previously said, but he basically says like, if we don't do this, the spirits of the people who died in Char's rebellion will never be able to rest. And that's where you get the image of Char, or Amuro and Char, who are, with the new Gundam, pushing back Axis, and the green light expands, and it's the end of Char's counterattack, and that's when the tear rolls down his cheek. And I think there's like, to me, part of the movie is that Hathaway saw like the miracle of Axis up close. Like he saw this thing of like human will pushing back against this massive meteor in this desperate bid and succeeding and protecting the Earth. And then nothing is fixed and nothing is better. And Hathaway's on Earth, and the Earth Federation is like forcibly deporting people into space. Like that's what the Manhunter thing is, that middle section of the movie where he's kind of in the slums or whatever of the city, and these military police are going around and checking people's identification. If you don't have your identification, you're getting booted out. And like the taxi driver he talks about having to like pay the bigwigs a lot of money to get his residency permit on Earth. And so he's like, he saw firsthand all the sacrifice and everything that went into saving the Earth, and nothing has changed. And so, like, he needs to find some way of, like, how do I justify this? Like, I can't let everything that happened and that he specifically did in that rebellion to be for nothing. Because if it continues on the path it's going on, nothing will have changed. And he can't accept or live with that.
Yeah. Absolutely. This is also, I really love that this movie is here filling in some of the space between this and F91. Mm-hmm. And I think one thing that I've mentioned before, but I think is important to talk about here, is that this really bolsters my personal headcanon that Unicorn Gundam just has to be a what-if story.
Yes.
Because I do really feel like Unicorn Gundam is one branch off of the end of Char's counterattack, where the light of hope from the meteor does inspire some kind of change and is almost like the happy ending version of it. And then I think Hathaway, F91, Victory Gundam are the Tomino pessimist version, yes, where the world trudges on darkly, and that light of hope is something that is always there. Tomino is not a complete pessimist. People always want to make things better. But, basically, in that version, it's just the Earth Federation slowly dissolves, and there are new problems in space, because there are always problems, because people make problems, right?
Well, in that version, eventually humanity brings itself to ruin, and then the cycle starts again, and you get Turnet Gundam, right? And that's where the hope reaches some kind of pseudo-culmination, is in Turnet Gundam.
Yeah, because Victory Gundam, you're on the other end where, we're near the ruin part, right?
Yes.
The Earth doesn't have a lot going for it by the end of Victory Gundam.
No.
Yeah. So I think Hathaway is actually, for the F91 line of the continuity, if you want to go in that direction, it's really great to have this story that is situated basically dead in the center of between Char's counterattack and F91, and seeing this world where, new types are not being taught in schools, they're being suppressed. You learn, because he says that to Gigi, you weren't taught about that in school, and she's like, we're not allowed. And you have the Manhunters coming around. I think this movie has, honestly, quite a bit of contemporary political relevance. The one that really strikes me is, obviously you have the Manhunters who are coming around, and they're basically like ice in space, of forcibly deporting people off the planet. But also, the image of the Manhunters coming around in a giant mobile suit, painted black and white, that they don't really know how to handle, because it's giant military equipment that they were not trained for, and it's just stomping through the city. Boy, that feels relevant to American life in 2021. Anyway, and then you have, and then of course, obviously the themes of just massive economic inequality, and this city that is on these extremes, which I did look it up. This city is Davao. It's in the Philippines, is where they are in this movie. And so, you have this incredible opulent wealth, and then you have these very overcrowded slums on the other end of the city. And it's all kind of bumping up against each other, and Hathaway in the middle going, and I feel like this is such a contemporary sort of pathology and thought that we're all going through, is looking at that card, that symbol, and going, we can't all live on Earth together, what is the solution to this thing, right? And it's something we're all kind of asking ourselves, probably throughout human history, but it feels very acute right now. And yeah, it just feels like such a key... Like, this makes me want to go through, like, the line of F-91 and Victory Gundam again, and I feel when the Hathaway is done, it's going to make all of that even richer to kind of see that line of decline of the Universal Century, you know what I mean?
Because from Tomino's perspective, when he was making it, like, that is the order in which he made it. He made Char's Counterattack, and then he did these novels, and then he did F-91, and then he did Victory. So, like, not only does it fit in that timeline narratively, like, it... in the chronology of when Tomino was creating the stories, he did it linearly. Yes. Yeah, I think this movie has, like, a lot of resonance, and I think that's, like, I think it's, like, one of the reasons why Gundam, like, in general, the franchise, like, is getting a resurgence of popularity, at least certainly in the West, is that, like, a lot of those core themes about, like, environmentalism and living on the earth and stuff like that are much more pressing right now than they were. I mean, they were pressing then, but, like, society did not want to confront how pressing it was. And now we're, like, kind of on the other side of that, where we are past the point where it is pressing. We're at the point where it is kind of done and we fucked it. And it seems like incredibly unlikely that we'll find a way to meaningfully push back against it at this point. And it makes it feel so present, right? That, like, you have a shot later in the movie of Hathaway on the beach, and the beach is covered in, like, trash and junk. And he's sort of in the middle, like, looking off to the right-hand side of the frame that is the ocean. And I think, like, the dirt and the pollution and the trash is kind of, like, ever present, particularly in that section of the city where it's not being cleaned up because it's not the high-rise skyscrapers. And I just feel like that sense of... that's like, it's happening, and people aren't doing anything about it. And the reasons why are, like, for the rich people is because they're scum, and then for, like, normal people it's because they can't do anything and they don't have the luxury to care. I think, like, a really powerful sequence and a very important sequence in the movie is in that middle bit where he's going around the city and he's kind of Hathaway's talking to normal people that are just living in the city, and they're like, man, why isn't Mafty doing anything about the Manhunters? He's like, yeah, man, the people should do something about this. And he talks to the taxi driver, and they start having that conversation, and then the taxi driver says, yeah, but then he's talking about all this stuff about all of humanity going down to the space. I just don't really get that, man. And I really love the way the taxi driver's written, because his dialogue is very, I think, pointed, and it's, like, well characterized, where he says, it's like, I don't have that much free time on my hand. Like, I don't have time to think about what's happening in 1,000 years. I'm thinking about what's happening the day after tomorrow. And Hathaway's kind of confronted with that, and he's sort of shocked because he hadn't really considered that it's like, Hathaway is not thinking at all about what's happening to him the day after tomorrow. He's just thinking about entirely what is going to happen 1,000 years from now.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the most, like, on-the-ground conditions Gundam stories we've ever seen, in terms of actually going to, like, sort of normal people around the space that we're in. Because usually we have characters who are thinking about pretty lofty things. Like, Amuro gets to think about pretty lofty things. Char is a very lofty thinker. Gundam 00, we just, went through all of that. Those are characters who, just by virtue of being in celestial being, are, like, into very lofty ideas, right? Mm-hmm. And I like how Hathaway is confronted with that, because he has... I want to talk about his plan, because it is an interesting... Like, it's almost like he's trying to compromise on, like, Char's vision of everyone needs to get off of Earth, but we're not going to throw an asteroid at you. It's almost like it is a more peaceful version of it. What Char was going to do was fucking horrific. And what Hathaway is doing is horrific, but, a little more pointed. Most people on Earth aren't going to die because of what Hathaway's doing. It's these more targeted attacks. But you also get this sense of, even from the beginning, it feels more hopeless than what Char was doing. It is not as grand a gesture. And it is also, they are up against much longer odds because of this. And they are up against the intransience of this horrible, crusty old government. It's a very interesting situation he's in. And also then you can't disconnect it from that being the entity that his dad works for. And while his dad is not mentioned much in this movie, he's kind of a specter around the scenes, you can't ignore that either, that this is a person he didn't have a particularly close relationship with, who represents some kind of element of patriarchy to him.
Yeah, and yes, I think it is, like, very deliberate that that Hathaway's plan is this kind of, like, middle of the road thing, right? It's like I'm not so abandoned hope in humanity that I'm just gonna fucking destroy the Earth to just completely force everybody, because that's like Char's plan is just like this like nuclear option of wipe it out, make the Earth uninhabitable, have myself get killed in the process, which I think is what Char wants to happen, and then that will create enough of a blank slate that hopefully the next person who takes over will have figured out a better way to deal with these problems. And then Amuro's solution is like too far on the other side, where he's like too preoccupied with being reactive and kind of protecting the people that are there, that he's not really doing anything to try to change the system, even if he does recognize the system is flawed and corrupt and bad. And Hathaway is like, well, I'm not going to kill everybody because that was fucking crazy. But I also need to do something. I can't just sit here and hope that eventually the new type revolution will occur or something. Something must be done. And so he's this much more targeted. Instead of killing everybody, I'm going to try to identify who are like the most important people in the Earth Federation. How do I need to eliminate them and like use that as pressure to push everybody and get people off the Earth and move people into space to try to break the system apart and create a new system that can be more equal and equitable and fair.
I think a really telling line for Hathaway is, I mentioned it earlier, but when he's talking to Gigi and it says something about like new types aren't real, right? And the way he says it, he has it's again, oh no, every line, there's a lot of consideration, right? There's such a contempt for that idea. And of course, Hathaway knows new types are real.
Yes.
Like, he knows for a fucking fact, because he knew Quest, and he knew Amuro, and he saw the light of hope, and he saw, like, that event with the Axis flash and all of that. He knows for a fact new types are real. I think what he's saying there is, like, and I fucking hate them, because the whole thing about Char's plan was predicated on new types. The whole idea that, well, if we just force everyone off of Earth, then humanity will be forced to evolve. And Amuro's plan was predicated on that, of if we just wait long enough, the new types will come to save us. And I think Hathaway is saying, and fuck all of them, because in the meantime, all of this shit is happening, and there's nothing being done about it. The new types will not save us. God will not come out of the sky and save us all. We have to save ourselves, so we're doing this, you know? And it is a much more... And that's what makes this whole story feel just so much more, like, kind of mature and frank and dark, is that sense of, like, the loftiness of a lot of it. Even though he is loftier than the taxi driver, he's also less lofty than Amuro or Char are, you know?
Yeah.
He is a lot more down to earth on just, like, I'm not going to do my big thing with an asteroid. I'm going to kill specific people, and it's going to be really dirty, and it's not going to look good, you know?
Yeah, because, that conversation he has with Gigi, where Gigi has a line there that is very funny, because she apparently she went to the Anakin Skywalker School of Political Philosophy, because she says that thing about, it's like, oh, like, well, because he's like, well, I know that the way that I do things is wrong and dirty, and, like, I'm killing people, but what other way is there? She's just like, well, you just have to establish a dictatorship where the dictator's never wrong. And it's like, yep, that's good one. That's a good one, Gigi. And then that's his response is, well, that person would have to be a god. And by the time I became, or anyone became that god, like, you know, with it being, you know, with Gundam implied that that's your new type, right? To have someone so wise and infallible that they could have that power and control things and not abuse it and fix these problems, by then everybody will be like that. Like, we're not going to have one person up here, this magical new type Jesus man that can save us. Like, by the time that we reach that level of enlightenment, his perspective is we will all have reached it. Like, but what do we do in the meantime, right? Like, you can't just sit around and wait for humanity to have evolved or whatever, if that's your belief that, like, humanity will improve and that this potential is there and it will happen in the future. You don't know when it's going to happen and what's going to happen to all the people in the meantime. Like, the Earth is full of this happening and these crimes and tragedy and cruelty and violence happening now, and we need to fix it now, not then. Yeah.
And I think what this movie is getting at does, even though this is a story written contemporaneously with Char's Counterattack, as we said, it feels so of the moment.
Yeah.
Because we are staring down the gun barrel at this point of climate change. We're in the gun barrel.
Yes.
You know, we had that picture flying around Twitter the other day of the fucking Pacific Ocean on fire because Exxon had another goddamn oil leak, you know? And you have the Pacific Northwest at 116 degrees.
Yeah.
And just buildings fucking melting, you know, because it is so out of control at this point, and it's only going to get worse from here. And we probably are going to see geoterrorism. You know, like, we probably are going to see this kind of thing, not with mobile suits, because we don't have that. But, like, you know, what Hathaway is talking about is not out of the question, because governments themselves clearly are not going to solve this problem. And there is going to be some kind of extreme action. We're going to have things like refugee crises because of, you know, land that is going to become uninhabitable. We're going to have all these kinds of issues politically that are going to come up. And, boy, like, Hathaway is probably wrong because he is being a terrorist, but it's hard to say what the right path is when you look at this situation. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of thing Gundam often presents you with, right?
Yeah. That these are like the hard problems that we are living with. And if, like, I think there's only one thing that I think Hathaway gets wrong is like a story about where we are, is that Hathaway presents the possibility that it's like, oh, and then all the rich people will stay on Earth and kick all the poor people off. And what's actually happening is all the rich people are trying to make space programs like Elon Musk so that they can go to space and have us all die here on like 200-degree hot Earth. That's the only place where they fucked it up. But that's just because in Universal Century, they've already done the space colony thing. So they can't do it the other way around.
Yeah, exactly. You know, at this point, frankly, the space colonies would be a fucking great solution. We just don't have that technology yet. So we should get on that. Let's build some space colonies. We know how to do it. It's in Gundam. It's been in Gundam for 40 years.
Yes, it's just a big cylinder that spins. It can't be that hard.
We just have to build the mobile suits. Look how many mobile suits we've built. We've been building Gunpla of them for years. We can do this, Sean.
Exactly. I mean, that's, I think, has been Tomino's master plan, is to improve the, like, technical engineering capacity of the young people of Japan by having them build plastic figures obsessively for decades until they're like, wait, we can just make these, and we can just, you know, use this technology to save humanity, not destroy it.
Sean and I are today announcing our run for president on the Build the Mobile Suits Goddammit party ticket.
Yes.
Anyway, yeah, so Hathaway, complex character. I feel like, you know, the conversations we're having about him remind me a lot of what we talked about with Char's Counterattack.
Yes.
It's very much a character in the mold of the characters in that movie where, you know, if this podcast didn't have, like, a time limit, we could go on forever about it, you know?
Yes, and I think it is... I think one of the things that's very fun about this movie specifically is it does feel like this interesting inversion of the way that Char's Counterattack is structured as a story, where part of Char's Counterattack's, like, plot structure, and I think what makes it, like, function effectively as a movie, is that movie is about you, the audience, trying to figure out what is going on with Char and peeling back his psychology. Why is he doing what he's doing? Because, like, I mean, Amuro has psychological complexity, but he's much more of an open book. Like, you can get what he's about. In a way that with Char, especially, it's so kind of discongruous with where he was at in Zeta. You're trying to, like, figure out what's going on with this guy. And in this movie, I think it's interesting that instead of that being a character who's positioned effectively as the antagonist, it's the character who's very definitively the protagonist of the movie. That you are with him, it is from his POV. Like, there are other important characters, but their importance is generally, like, related to their proximity to and interactions with Hathaway. And so having your main character be that figure, that Char-esque figure who has this dark psychological complexity that you're, like, picking away at throughout the movie, it's just a very exciting, I think, very compelling structure for a story.
Absolutely. And, you know, someone said on Twitter to me the other day when I was talking about the movie, they said, it felt to me like a Gundam movie, but a spy movie. Mm-hmm. And I actually think that's a great way to think about it. And I don't think it's, like, fully that, but it's, like, got a dusting of espionage to it, you know? Where, like, and the specific spy genre I would link it to, even though it's got a James Bond theme song, and we'll talk about that later, is it reminds me of, like, Jean Le Carré espionage stuff. Like, it's very Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, of it being very quiet. It's a lot of characters who do not really speak their minds, but they talk a lot. You've got, you know, the quiet sequences of, like, Hathaway in his hotel checking his bag, and it doesn't draw a lot of attention to it, but he's got, like, the little hair on the inside of the bag to make sure no one's opened it, and he's checking under things for, like, mics and bugs and stuff like that. It is about as close as to Gundam Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy as I think we're going to get, and saying that sentence just makes me love the movie more.
Yes.
Yeah,
I think that is a very, very good comparison. Before we move on from Hathaway to talk about the other characters, there's one other scene I really wanted to quickly shout out, because I think it is a, like, great kind of startling moment, is at the end of that whole big action sequence at the end of the movie, and Gauman's Gundam gets stabbed and the sparks come out. And then Kenneth comes riding up on a fucking horse because he's like, I told you it'd be faster. And it's a good detail. He has a riding crop with him for much of the movie. And it was something I didn't notice until the second viewing, that it's like, oh, he is just like, that's part of his thing. He's a horse guy. He's got like a big horse, like brass figure that he takes out that he's putting on his desk at the end of the movie. He's just a horse dude. But he comes running up and then Gigi yells, Taisa, or Captain, and runs towards him. And then Hathaway has that direct flash of a POV shot from his perspective of the scene from Char's Counterattack where Amuro and Char are beating the shit out of each other, and Quest goes running after them, yelling the word Taisa, and it's because that is the way that like Lala and a lot of people think of Char, is by that rank, and you get that sequence from Hathaway's perspective as he's watching this girl that he was infatuated with running after these older men, and him feeling powerless, right? And then it cuts back to Hathaway in real time, and his face is blank and his eyes are blacked out, and you don't see his expression. And then it cuts away to Kenneth, and Kenneth says Hathaway, and then it kind of cuts back and he's normal. I found that scene very powerful. That's like, I think, because that is like the most direct you feel the pain he has, and like the jealousy and the regret, and like this very complex mix of very dark emotions he has connected to Quest, and then by proximity to Gigi. And it's just communicated, I think, like entirely visually in that quick sequence. And I found that scene, especially like rewatching it, like very striking.
Well, it's the turning point, right? Like, that's our Act 2 to Act 3 turning point, because up to that point, he's kind of just fucking around in the city. And specifically, that whole air raid, the purpose of it was to get him out. It was a cover, right? Yeah. But he doesn't go with Esmeralda. Or is it Emeralda or Esmeralda?
Emeralda.
Emeralda, okay. It's the made-up version of the name. So it's Emeralda, and he doesn't go with her, and he keeps not going with her because he's holding on. I mean, literally, it's a very apt metaphor, right? It's very obvious. He's holding on to this woman who is sort of a remanifestation of Quest, but also possibly is like a way forward. It's almost like, is this another path for me through this woman, you know? Mm-hmm. And there is like an actual human connection there in that moment that I talked about earlier, where they're standing under the fiery mobile suit and they're both like rubbing each other's backs, and it's this very tender, tactile, kinesthetic moment. And then she runs off, and he sees all of those emotions that drove him here just come flooding back, and then he leaves. And he is, for the last act of the movie, he is in Mafty mode, where he is, I gotta go get the Gundam, we're gonna rescue Gauman, we're gonna get off this base, and we're gonna go to this place in Australia, you know? And so that's when he kicks into that and is like telling himself, nope, you know what, I don't need this, I'm cutting off my human ties and I'm doing this. But of course, as you said earlier, Sean, I don't think we really believe Mr. Hathaway there, because I think in the future movies, I'm assuming this will all come back.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I believe it will.
Yeah. He can tell himself whatever he wants. He is a person driven by his emotions, as all characters are. So, all right. Should we talk about Gigi or Kenneth next?
Either one. Which one do you want to do?
Let's talk about Kenneth, because Gigi interacts with both of them. So let's do Kenneth, because he's the other side of things here. And he's the first character who talks in the movie.
Yep.
The movie starts with him and Gigi having this conversation where we're sort of lightly exposited to the Mafty stuff. And they start talking, and she susses him out immediately as a military guy. And he is a fascinating character because he is very likable, very charismatic. He would be the hero in any other version of this story, right? Mm-hmm. And he's the kind of the perfect foil for Hathaway in that sense, because he sort of has all of those social skills Hathaway lacks, but he is also very smart and cunning, and it is a great performance and piece of character design and animation.
Yeah, no, it's like a good. So he's effectively the antagonist, right? Because he's the captain of the Earth Federation group, what is eventually called the Kirky Squad or the Cersei Squad, depending on how you want to pronounce it, and all of that. But he's immediately extremely likable. And they cast Junichi Suabe, who's an actor I like a lot. He's, I think, probably best known. The thing I know him most from is he plays one of the main characters named Archer from Fate Stay Night. So it's a great character and amazing performance. He's also been in Gundam stuff before. He is one of the cyber new type boys from Seed Destiny. He's kind of like the cool one of that group from Seed Destiny with like Stella in them. So he's in there. And then he's been in like other Gundam stuff too. I'm pretty sure he's in Rekko and G.
He's in Age coming up. He's racked in Age. He's also in G Rekko. He's like 4 or 5 people. It looks like he's a bunch of smaller roles. And he's in Build Divers. So he's been in a lot of Gundam stuff.
Because he is. So I watched the Gundam YouTube channel interview with him that Ono Kensho was on. And he talks about that he's from that generation that he kind of grew up watching First Gundam and being in love with the series. So it very much feels like he's like a Gundam diehard fan, that this seems like kind of like a dream role for him. And one thing that was interesting that he talked about in that interview is that they actually redesigned Kenneth's character for this movie. So like the traditional Kenneth design from like the original art and the art they've used in the games is a character that looks a little bit more like Char. It's like a tall white dude with blonde hair that's like very slicked back. And here they go for this sort of like brown, almost like it's like sort of vaguely Arabic kind of character design, where he's darker skin, he's got black hair. One detail I like about his hair a lot is that like it's got this kind of scruffy look, but it's a very designed scruffy look. There's a great little piece of character detail at the end of the movie when he's talking to Gigi, and he's after the whole climactic sequence has happened, and he looks in the mirror, or not the mirror, like the window, and sees a reflection of himself in the window and sees his hair's not tousled in the perfect way. He likes his hair tousled, so he fixes his hair looking at that reflection, which I think tells you a lot about who he is as a character, is that Kenneth is this guy who has these multiple sides. He has this big, affable, fun, kind of like happy jock kind of thing, right? Like he's got this like, oh, I can be friends with anyone, I can joke around, I'm just like a good guy. And he's hitting on like every lady he meets. He hits on Gigi, he hits on Mace Flower, who is one of the flight attendants, which is a very good name, from the beginning of the movie. It's also intimated by something that Gigi says, that he's married, that she says is like, well, did you have to take off your ring on your left-hand finger to talk to me? And so he's flirting around with all these women, but he's doing it in a way that feels like charming, like more charming, less sexual harassment because of the way he carries himself. But then he is also a military commander who, like, when you see him go into that mode at the end of the movie, he is brutal. He torches Gauman. He tells Lane to use Gauman as like a human shield, and he seems like obsessive and like merciless in his pursuit of Mafty. And I think the thing that's very striking about Kenneth in the movie is like juxtaposed with Gigi and Hathaway that also have these kind of multiple sides of their self that they're playing with and showing in different ways to different people. Gigi and Hathaway feel incredibly lost for the whole movie, and Kenneth is extremely confident in who he is. He has no trouble controlling what side of himself he shows when to whom. And I think that's the thing that makes him like both very likable, but also kind of like frightening as a character, is that he's so confident compared to Hathaway and Gigi. Like he doesn't feel like he doesn't hesitate about anything once in the whole movie. And there's something about that I think the movie's kind of showing you that this is scary. That sense of absolutism to Kenneth, that he doesn't care. He doesn't question the morality of what he's doing. He doesn't stop to think about if Mafty might be right or not. It's his job to capture this Mafty dude. I don't know if there's a like further history or something with it, but the movie never intimates that there's like Mafty killed my sister or something. There's nothing like that. It's just, this is my job. I'm commander of this squad. I'm going to do my job. I'm going to do my thing. And I'm going to do what I need to do it. And how unshakable he is in that attitude is a really powerful contrast with the other characters in the film.
Yeah, absolutely. He is such a great character in that sense, and I think all the characters, as you say, are wearing masks in different scenes and in different ways, but he's the one who wears it most confidently, where you don't even notice it's a mask for a while, you know? You have to see him tussle the hair to realize, oh shit, this is all a performance, right? And he is very brutal deep down, and it's an interesting character because he, in some sense, reminds you a little bit of like Captain Bright, and like, you know, he's the company guy who's very competent and all of that. But Bright is someone with a very strong moral compass who did switch sides in the story. In Zeta, obviously, and was definitely driven by an overarching sense of wanting to protect people, and that's true all the way through Char's counterattack, obviously, even if it limits how he sees the world sometimes. This very much feels like someone who's, like, on the team for the team's sake, almost. You know what I mean? You do not have that same sense of, like, questioning ethics and the lofty ideals of the future of humanity or any of that. It's, Mafty's the terrorist that I'm going to catch. And I think one of the scenes where you realize it's most ruthless is late in the movie when he says, when he kind of plays his hand and you realize he's known Hathaway as probably Mafty for a long time, and it's just how much he was kind of pulling him along like a fish on a string. It definitely sets him up as a formidable opponent for the future movies, and I'm very excited to see how that will play through, because as you say, this movie does not really have a final encounter between the two of them, because it's sort of like mediated through Lane, but obviously more of that is coming.
And I think a really key sequence with Kenneth that I didn't note much on first viewing, because I didn't have a context to see it as a thematically important interaction, but on second viewing I think it's really kind of a big piece of the movie, is at the beginning of the movie, when before the hijacking happens, he has the whole flirting thing he does with Gigi, which fails, and she kind of just rebuffs his advances, and he goes away, and then he starts hitting on the attendant lady, Miss Flower, and their conversation I find very fascinating, because it's a very, anytime someone in a Tomino work, he brings up the difference between adults and children, you should pay attention, because it's such a key thematic thing for him. And in that exchange, he's talking about, they're talking about, age and stuff like that, because Gigi's quite younger than he is. Gigi is the youngest of the three characters. I think she's supposed to be, 19 or something. She's described specifically as a teenager at one point early in the film. And he says, it's not that bad getting older, because me being older, I can talk to a beautiful woman like you, and fine. If I was a teenager, my heart would be beating super fast, and I would be all awkward. And the lady says, well, there's a part of me that wants you to have that reaction, to be flustered and nervous. And then that's when the attack happens. And I think that there's a key thing there of that's how Kenneth is characterized, as he is the adult of the three of them. He is the one who's he doesn't get nervous. He's not trying, because part of that interaction is he also says, well, that's just you wanting to recreate the experience you had when you had your first love. But that's not how it works. That's not realistic. And that's how he sees the world, is that it's just you can't recapture what it was when you were young. You can't recapture that idealism and all of that. That at a certain point, you just have to live. And he's much more like the taxi driver. He's thinking about the day after tomorrow. His last major line of the movie is, he says to Gigi when she's setting this clock at the end, that living is a hard thing. Basically, and Gigi responds that I'm not so concerned about living. But I think it tells you that Kenneth's mindset is just he's doing that day-to-day thing, and it's his job, and he's just doing it, and he's very good at it, and that's all he thinks about, and he's not worried about anything else, compared to Hathaway and Gigi, that still are kind of in this weird liminal space where they are experienced, they are older, they have they're both experienced in life and sexually and stuff like that. But there is still this naivete and this idealism to both the characters that I think makes them nervous and awkward in that way still. That Kenneth is saying that you can't get back, and that is lost. And I think that juxtaposition is also really important.
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, anytime we're thinking about sort of that transition from childhood to adulthood is key to Tomino, and I think this is interesting because this is one of the only major Tomino Gundam works where we're dealing with adults, basically. F91 is I feel like high school seniors,
Yes.
But that's also, you don't have a ton of time for character work in that movie, and so you do have these different layers here, and Hathaway is definitely someone who I think is stranded between sort of the idealism of youth and the hard-edged reality of adulthood, and that is sort of, you see that in all of his, just his basic plan for the world, right? We were talking about it earlier, and then Gigi is someone who I feel like is very unsettled as a character, not just because she's mysterious, but because she doesn't know herself all that well either. And Kenneth is the one who knows himself, and that's really interesting.
Yeah, and in that opening exposition scene between Kenneth and Gigi, Gigi, he describes Mafty's like goal and plan as specifically being childish, and Gigi responds that you shouldn't dismiss something just because it's childish, because even a child's reasoning can sometimes be right. It's basically what she literally says, which I think is also like, it kind of sets
That's
up...
about as Tomino aligned as you're ever going to
Yes,
get.
and it sets up, I think, the dynamic between those three characters well before you actually get that dynamic like manifesting. And that's why I think I only kind of noticed the line happen on the second viewing.
Yeah, absolutely. So then you do have Gigi, who is quite the enigma in this movie, but I think a really fascinating one. Works better for me as a character, I will say, in this incomplete story so far than Quest does in Char's Counterattack. I think she's a really fascinating figure who is beautifully played. I think there's some phenomenal animation with her in specific scenes. And I am very curious to see where it's going to go from here, because there's no... What's so fascinating about her is there's no like obvious major reason for her to be a part of the story, other than that she's there and she bounces off these characters in very interesting ways. And honestly, the main motivator for the plot is this random encounter Hathaway has with her that makes him doubt or slow down or something or other, right?
Yeah.
And Kenneth, I don't know if he doubts, but he also slows down around her as well. And that's sort of what kicks this in motion.
Yeah, I think she is like one of those really... I think she's like one of the most fascinating kind of Tomino style heroine characters. And I think it's especially because she's given so much time to breathe and like interact with everybody, which I think is the thing that Quest misses, right? That like Quest is one of the characters that she is interesting and she works well within Char's Counterattack, but I think she kind of gets thrown around pretty wildly by like the big plot movements of that film. And here the movie's being so slow. I mean, so much of the film's time is just spent on conversations that Gigi has with Hathaway. There's like a good solid that like 10 to 15 minutes of them just in like the penthouse together after they get off the plane. That is just like conversations between those two characters. So Gigi is played by Ueda Reina, another just like great actress. Ganyu in Genshin Impact, which I'd like noticed almost immediately, even though it's a very different performance, but I've been using Ganyu as like my main in that game for like 4 months at this point. So I've heard a lot of Ganyu's voice. I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's Ueda Reina. She would also be well known for this podcast, although that character has not shown up a lot, but she's also Kano in Kimetsu no Yaiba.
She's going to have such great stuff to do.
Yes,
she's going to be really good as that. Yep.
Yeah, and I think this is because I've seen her in a bunch of stuff because she's just like in a bunch of stuff. She hasn't played like a lot of like main characters, but she's like in every like modern anime she plays somebody because she's very good. This is, I think, like the best performance she's given. I think largely just because it gives her the most to do as a performer. I think that she just knocks it out of the park, because Gigi in particular has this huge range as a character where, you know, she is the youngest of our three leads. So if you're looking at that like child to adult transition, I think that she's interesting in that she is the youngest. And so she, I think, is least able to actually fully control what she's showing. But I think she's also the one that is like, has the most kind of, in some ways, complexity underneath it all. That I feel like so much of the movie is about things happening and you kind of seeing how Gigi reacts to it, because Gigi's reactions are so different, particularly in that first half of the movie. It feels like she's like, not that she's a different character in every scene, but like you're constantly, I think, surprised by things that she does or how she reacts to moments. So like, you know, you have the moment where Hathaway early on comes out of his hotel room and walks in on her, and she's changing in kind of the main room, and she gets embarrassed and runs away, as Hathaway like responds very coldly of being like, why would you even be doing this? Like, even if you're like, I forget what it is, like, even like if I hadn't been here, I hate women who just stand around and like are naked or whatever and like are sort of flagrant about that stuff. And she gets upset and slams the door, and it has this very kind of, what is coded in anime, it's a very cliche kind of scene that like marks her as being very kind of like naive in some ways and very young, which is strikes you odd because it's, the character is played as a seductress at the beginning of the movie, or like someone who is so desired specifically by Kenneth and by the other people on the other men on that plane. And you find out at the end of the movie that she is like basically the sexual companion for this very old man. Which is true, like, I'll like, because, you know, you don't it happens at the end of the movie that you might think that it's like, oh, is that like fake? Is she lying about that? But that's just like what her backstory is, that she's this young, beautiful woman who is like basically a live-in maid and sexual partner for this like much, much older man who's extremely rich and pays her and has bought her a apartment in Hong Kong that she's going to. And that's what her kind of backstory is. And she's not some mysterious psycho new type lady from Jupiter or some shit like that. That she's like a normal person living in that kind of scenario. And she's in this weird liminal space, kind of like with Hathaway, between being an adult and being a child. And I think she doesn't know fully how to respond or think about herself or interact with someone like Hathaway, who she is interested in and is her age. And there's not this like power discrepancy between the two of them and all that kind of stuff. Like, I just think there's such a rich mixture of complex emotions that are underneath this very kind of unflappable exterior that she gives for a lot of the movie.
What's, I think, interesting in this dynamic is I think she knows how to play off Kenneth.
Yeah.
He's an easy guy to play off of. She knows what mask to use. And I think Hathaway is the same with Kenneth. I think Hathaway may be a little intimidated, but Hathaway also generally knows like what side to put up because he's been around military people his entire fucking life, right? So he kind of knows what to do to maintain his Hathaway Noa cover, as he calls it there, which I think is an interesting theme in this movie we haven't talked about, is that he's almost not viewing himself as Hathaway Noa, but views that as a cover, you know? But anyway, but I think Hathaway and Gigi together, neither of them know how to play off the other. And so much of their time together in the movie is feeling the other one out and trying to figure out like what mask, what presentation, what way of going about it is the way into this other person, you know? And I think the closest they maybe ever get is in the elevator when they are trying to escape the building. And they are both, you have the couple on the other end that is clearly like a Federation bigwig and a woman who is not his wife. And they're being seen, and they start whispering to each other, and Hathaway kind of leans into the mysterious mafty of it all, and he's being like the mysterious like older gentleman there a little bit, almost like he's putting that on, and then she kind of is pushing back and questioning him. There's a great shot of her there where she says, "I think you do terrible things," or something like that, and it's a fisheye lens on her, and so her head is like all kind of distorted in the image, which is an amazing perfect shot on a very Tomino line. It's a very like Tomino moment to me, because I feel like that's, I don't know if he would have done that exactly. He doesn't usually do sort of like camera moves like that, but it's the same kind of framing I think you might get, and it's a very striking moment. And then of course all hell breaks loose with the escape, and she kind of falls apart, and he doesn't know who he is at all in that moment, other than that he's trying to hang on to this person he doesn't really understand. And then they're kind of broken apart after the end of that, because when Kenneth gets there, she goes right to him, as you said, in that moment that reminds him of Quest. But it's very different than Quest. Quest goes off because she's really fucking taken with this Char guy, you know, and Amuro's not giving it to her. I don't mean sex, I meant, you know.
Yeah, she's in search of a father figure, which Amuro understands, and Amuro understands that he cannot be that for her. And Char thinks that she's interested in a sexual partner, and he's using that as a lure, even if he's not interested in it, because he's a psychopath and doesn't understand people.
Yeah, so there you go. And I think this is a different moment, and it's honestly, it's just like safety of like, I know how to suck up to this fucking military guy, and this is someone I can go like, and he will get me on the plane, and I will be safe and away from these fucking crazy mobile suits. And it's a kind of breaking point between the two of them.
Yeah, I think that's a really good reading, that she knows how to push all the right buttons with Kenneth whenever she needs to or wants to, but neither her nor Hathaway knows how to get the desired reaction out of the other, which I think is why they're so attracted to one another, like not even necessarily in a sexual way, but just in like a human way, because I think they both maybe identify and understand that they're both kind of lost souls that don't really know where they're going or what they're doing or like how to kind of live their life. Like Hathaway's so in his own head, and Gigi seems to like have really kind of no place in the world. Like her life, as we get that backstory at the end, feels like it must be so attached to this relationship, to this man, in a way that is certainly like the way that society sees it is incredibly inappropriate and kind of makes her gross or undesirable, which is why she kind of hides it from people. And I think that's what makes that ending when she says that, like, a really powerful moment at the end of the movie, where it makes it feel like it's the first time she's really being honest with Kenneth in any way, in a way that she reveals something about herself that she knows that Kenneth is going to make her undesirable to Kenneth in some way, that makes her seem dirty or something in his eyes. Whether or not Kenneth takes it that way, I think, is something to be seen in the next movie. But it's this moment of her kind of letting that guard down around him, because I think she no longer needs or is interested in Kenneth in that way, and is maybe still taken by Hathaway. But yeah, it's just such a, like, a fascinatingly complex character that is in that very Tomino vein of, like, the more you try to, like, hold on to the character to understand it, the more it kind of starts slipping through your fingers in a way that makes it, like, so enticing as a viewer to have to try to break down what's going on with her.
Absolutely, and I think it also, her being detached from, like, the military, yes, or a new type academy, or she's not in a mobile suit, and I don't know what happens in the next two. It doesn't seem like she's going to be in a mobile suit. Mm-hmm. I'd be super surprised if that's where the plot goes. And it's just a very different version of a character type that we're familiar with, done very well, performed phenomenally, as you say, by Reina Ueda. It's great. It's a great character, and a great sort of triptych of characters.
Yes.
Is there anyone else sort of in the movie that we want to mention before we move on from character stuff?
There's, like, really no other, really, I mean, the next most major character is Lane, but he's just, like, the stand-in Gundam lad, who's piloting the Penelope.
I do like the stuff with Lane, though. I do like, at the end, like, the whole idea that, you see just how fucking ruthless Kenneth is in throwing Gauman on the mobile suit with him as a hostage. And I like that Hathaway knows what button to push there when he meets Lane. And he's like, I've met Gundam boys before. Uh-huh. Fuck you. You're holding a hostage, you coward. And Lane is like, I am not a coward, and you will not besmirch my honor.
Yes.
And so he throws Gauman out of the thing. And it's one of the savvier little things sort of Hathaway pushes there, where it kind of makes it feel like he's making it think it's Lane's idea. And it's like Lane is doing what Hathaway wants him to do there.
Yeah. One thing with that side of the movie I do want to talk about, it's less about Lane specifically, but more about the Penelope, is there is this, like, light undercurrent that I think is very interesting of Odyssey references. So Penelope is the name of Odysseus' wife. So people unfamiliar with the Odyssey, it's the ancient Greek epic poem that is about Odysseus after that he does the Trojan War stuff, trying to get home to Penelope, and then what does he do once he gets home to sort of, like, win back his home as has been taken over by this group of suitors that are like courting his wife after he's been lost at sea for 10 years. So Penelope is, like, as icons in fiction, Penelope is about, like, this objective to go home, and then also, like, the icon of, like, the faithful wife, of, like, this faithful wife that is at home and is waiting for her husband and for him to get home, and she won't, like, she's always there waiting, like, at the sea, believing that her husband will come home one day. And then the other major Odyssey reference then is the name of the squad. So Kenneth decides he doesn't want it to be the Kimberly squad, but he also doesn't want to call it the Kenneth squad because it would be too egotistical. So he comes up with the name the Kirky squad, or people might be more familiar with the general English pronunciation as Circe. She is the enchantress, one of the enchantresses that Odysseus meets on his way back home, and she seduces Odysseus after he kind of defeats her. And he ends up staying with her on her island for several years. The movie describes her as being an enchantress that tames fierce beasts, and that's not really how she's depicted in the Odyssey. I mean, her relationship to beasts is that she shapeshifts people into animals, so she turns Odysseus' crew into pigs. But I think they're kind of adjusting the reading slightly for how they're interpreting the mythology in the movie. But I do think there's sort of an interesting thing they're playing with the idea of Odysseus and Hathaway, of Odysseus as a hero is symbolic of wandering. Like, that's how in Renaissance and on artwork, Odysseus is always depicted as a character who has wanderlust and can never really find where he's trying to go, or once he gets where he's trying to go, ends up journeying off again, and so he has no real destination. Is why he's, like, in hell in the Divine Comedy, is because he has wanderlust, and that kind of connects to one of the sins and stuff like that. And I think there's this interesting notion of whether or not Hathaway is an Odyssean figure or to what degree he is, because Kenneth specifically uses the Penelope as almost like a lure. He 2 times in the movie kind of offers the idea of giving the Penelope to Hathaway in this way that makes it feel like one interpretation of this is that that's like there's a world where that's where Hathaway is supposed to be. He's supposed to be the Gundam boy. He's supposed to be the boy that's with the Earth Federation, and he goes home to Penelope being like this symbol of him going home. That's like this symbolic option available to him that is opened by Kenneth, either like intentionally or not, with whether or not he like really knows it's Mafty at that point. And then Kirky as being this character that leads Odysseus astray and prevents him from going where he's supposed to go, and Kenneth kind of pushes Guy into being that role, and like, you know, like portrays her as being this goddess. He says the goddess of victory, but this goddess that he's going to use to get to victory, and like that is the way, is like she is leading Hathaway astray. She's leading Odysseus like off the path of him trying to go home, whichever home that is he's trying to go to. And so it's like a light sort of like sprinkling of little Odyssey stuff they do around the edges, but I do think it's like very evocative of some of the stuff they're trying to do in the film, that as someone who likes the Odyssey a lot, I appreciate it quite a bit.
Absolutely, and I'm so glad we had you to you have this background to break it down, because I'm sure I am 100% sure there is no other podcast on this movie that will go into that level of depth on the Odyssey references within Mobile Suit Gundam Hathaway. That's why you come to Weekly Suit Gundam, guys.
Yeah, but I think it's a very particular choice. Yeah, yes. like it's particularly because with the Penelope thing, I didn't catch it then, and then he says Kirky. I'm like, well, there's only one place where Kirky fucking pops up, really, is in the Odyssey. Like, she's not a major character in any other myth.
Yeah, if it were just the Gundam Penelope without the Kirky reference, you probably wouldn't read that much into it, but when they're both there and they're both coming from Kenneth, it's pointed.
Yes. It's I think a canny use of some of like the general iconography of the Odyssey, and again, I think it's mostly just trying to evoke that sense of lostness that Hathaway has, that he doesn't know where his home is and he doesn't know how to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that does do it for all the major characters. There's one other sequence that we've talked about a little bit, but I think we want to go into more, which is the ending of the movie. Mm-hmm. We talked about the middle, big set piece a lot, but I do want to focus a little bit on this ending with Hathaway going up into the lower atmosphere, basically, lower orbit, I should say, and getting the Gundam back that he had been... So the whole plot is that he had been up at Anaheim on the moon, getting this new Gundam, and then, of course, Anaheim are a bunch of fucking backstabbing corporate assholes, so they also build one for the Federation. But he goes up and gets his... What is the name of his
GG?
Gundam?
It's the XIG. They pronounce it like Kuzigi in Japanese, but I think GG is probably how you're supposed to say it.
Which is a very cool name. And I think, you said it earlier, but my God, that entire sequence. I've seen some complaints of like, why does it have to happen at night in the sky? It's so dark. And I'm like, yeah, that's what's fucking cool about it. Because they're up in like lower orbit. He has Emeralda's mobile suit like going out and trying to get the like big tank like pod it's in. And then Hathaway goes in there and going through all of like the doors and passages, and then gets into the GG Gundam. Man, it is a cool sequence, and then I think the entire sequence after that, where it is such a flight-based Gundam fight, but like flight-based, but not just in terms of like up-down. It's so much about maneuverability within this complicated space, and it goes from the clouds all the way down to the water. It is, and there's so much motion to it. It's a phenomenal action set.
Yeah, it's great. I think like specifically like the lead-in also is just such a iconic feeling moment of Hathaway is like gets in the pod, and he's done his whole monologue that we kind of went over of him kind of convincing himself, I'm going to cut away like these confusing relationships I made. I'm going to become Mafty Nouveau Aaron. He gets in the thing, and then it seems like he kind of almost like hesitates a little bit to actually pilot the Gundam, and then it's falling down into the Earth's atmosphere or through the atmosphere, and he's like, oh my God, and everything's shaking. He's like, I just got hit. And then he has this quick flash where the movie plays super fast in backwards, all the way back to the beginning, which I think like is partially there to make you feel like to re-question that moment at the beginning of him being on the plane. Now that you've had that explanation from Hathaway that he was there to see the faces of all the ministers before he killed them. So I think a major question in the movie is why? Was he doing it out of spite because he's like, I need to look you in the eyes basically before I kill you? Or is he doing it as a way to try to convince himself not to? I think it's probably both. But he has that, and then you get Amuro Torufuria saying his one line in the movie, but if you're going to do one line, my fucking god, it is such a like legendary line reading, and it's such a cool line where he says, "Migamaeteru toki ni wa shinigami wa konai mono da, Hathaway," which means like when you're waiting for it or when you're like on guard for it, the Reaper or death will not come for you, Hathaway. Which I love that line so much, and I feel like there's so much you can read into what that means, or like what is the spirit of Amuro trying to communicate or tell Hathaway in that moment. Like, it's just a, because I think one way I look at it is Hathaway is like, I think there's a part of Hathaway that wants to be caught, and there's a part of him that like wants someone to like kill him to put him out of like the misery of having to make this choice of to become this terrorist and kill these people for the greater good. But if that's what he wants, if he's preparing for it, it's never going to happen. He's too guarded, he's too ready for it, and like death is not going to come for you. That it's like, if this is the path you want to walk, you have to do it with abandon. Like you can't do it and be guarded and keep it all caught up. Like you have to be willing to die and just embrace it and go for it, and that's the only way that you can do this. And it's just a very evocative. I found it like a very kind of like goosebumps moment when Furia's voice comes on.
Oh, I mean, it's such a goosebumps moment that when it happened, when I was watching the movie, I was like forward in my chair already because of the way they do the sequence where everything is shaking and falling apart, and then you have the rewinding the movie, and then Toru Furia's voice comes on, and I rewound the movie a little bit to catch it again because I was like, what did I just hear? It is so fucking good. It is Toru Furia. I feel like it is Amuro, but it is also very much in the like Ribbons Allmark vein from Double O of like he is putting so much weight and like sly menace and everything into it. Do you know what I mean? It is like Toru Furia has this style where he can also be like almost sound like a fucking fox trickster god, you know? Like I don't know how else to say it, but he has such a like playfulness to it that is there that is also very striking. And the choice to have it be Amuro who reaches out and sort of talks in that moment, whether it's a literal like new type flash or whether it is just, you know, Hathaway imagining things, is such a loaded way to do it. Because again, that line is verbatim in the book, but it's not Amuro coming out and saying it. Which you couldn't do in a book quite the same way anyway, right?
It wouldn't have the same impact.
The whole point. No, because the whole point here is that you hear Toru Furia just break through the movie for a second. The screen even goes black for him to say it, you know? And then Hathaway kind of snaps into focus there. And I agree with your read on it. I think we had a Twitter listener who suggested the same thing of like this sort of death wish concept, but also this sense of Hathaway, the whole movie not fully committing, right? And I don't know if he's fully committed at the end of the movie, because that's a question for the future movies, but he does at least kick into mobile suit pilot mode here. And I think it's another notable thing about this movie is that our main character doesn't get in a mobile suit until like the 80-minute mark of a 90-minute movie. You know, it's a very, very careful choice that this whole movie, getting in the suit is the end of this part of the story, not the beginning. Yeah. You know? And that's very clear and a very precise choice. And when he gets in it, he is a pretty magnificent pilot. And he has a very strong Gundam, and that's part of it. But he does outplay Lane a little bit, both in getting Gauman back, and then the way he tricks Lane is also sort of playing to his youthful ego and everything with using the beam rifle that he throws away, and Lane thinks he's killed him, and then Hathaway just throws everything at him.
Oh my god.
And it is an amazing sequence.
It's just everything in the action sequence. I mean, everything we're saying earlier about like the use of 3D space and 3D camera in depth and the cockpit views. Like there's a great shot where it's from Hathaway's perspective in his cockpit, and Lane is coming at him from like basically Hathaway. I think he's looking to like the left, and then you see in the other side from the 360 cockpit, Lane's Penelope coming in from the right, and it shoots like a pink laser or whatever, and then the camera swivels around with Hathaway's perspective as he looks in the other direction and sees it, and then blocks it with his shield. Just like incredible camera work. And then yes, the conclusion of the fight is great. Having the, that I think like the way they do the direction is one of the things that makes what is a pretty standard like Gundam action move, which is the like throw my beam rifle and have it and it blows up and then the enemy thinks that I'm dead and then you come around and defeat them. Like that's happened in a bunch of Gundam action scenes before. But here I think it's done so fresh because you're so grounded in Lane's POV throughout it, and like him shooting at the Gigi as it is zooming away, and then he hits and you see a big explosion, but the hit is from so far away that it really sells the sense that it just looks like the Gigi got blown up from that perspective. And so Lane's characterization of being this very talented pilot who has never really been in real combat just assumes that must be it, and he goes in, and then because he hasn't had really any combat experience, and so he doesn't, he's not on guard, even though he should be, to Hathaway coming in. And then, yes, that missile sequence where he just shoots like fucking 100,000 missiles, and Lane like shooting down a bunch of them, but then some of them start hitting, and then you get this great close-up on Lane's eyes and like his pupils as they widen and he realizes he's lost. And then like those couple that start hitting him start being like 5 and 6, and then it's like he just starts hitting by like dozens of missiles, and then the Penelope sinks into the ocean. It's a great climax.
Well, and the eye shot, what's extra great about it is that in the reflection of his pupil, you see all the missiles coming. And you have him, when he's going back against it, he's flying away from them, and he's like skimming the back of the Gundam on the water, like firing at all the missiles, but it's not nearly enough because there's just so many. Yeah, it is a really invigorating sequence. I think my only minor complaint about that whole sequence is that the design of the two Gundams are close enough that there was some visual confusion for me, especially on a first viewing of who was who. Hathaway's is the one with more white. It's got fewer colors on it.
Yeah, and the Penelope is like... it's almost like a dragon looking, because the Penelope is more like a mobile armor, because there is a thing called the Odysseus Gundam that's inside of it. Like they don't talk about that in the movie, but when I looked up like the Gunpla stuff, like there is. Yeah. So if you want more Odyssey stuff, it is very specifically it is the Odysseus Gundam in there. But yes, I'm with you that on first viewing I kind of got lost, especially because I'd never really seen those Gundam designs before. But then on second viewing, I think once you know, okay, this is kind of what the designs are, it's a little bit easier to read.
Yeah, and the direction is very clear. Yeah. It's just some shots where they're both in the frame together. You'll lose it a little bit, but yeah. It also helps that, Galman is in Hathaway's suit at that point, so whenever you cut inside a cockpit, you also have two people in one and one in the other, so there's lots of ways they differentiate it, but it is very good. I love when Hathaway is going to do, I already mentioned this shot, but when he's going to do the big maneuver where he's going to, he says he's going to do it all in one shot, and you have Galman in the back, like, trying to hang on for dear life on this seat, because, Hathaway is all strapped in, but he's doing this crazy, maneuver. It's very good stuff. I always love, when you throw someone in the back of a cockpit in a Gundam series. It always seems so unsafe, but there's never much attention to like the physics of it. I like that we get a little bit of attention to the physics of it, and it's great.
Yes. And that reminds me of something else that is true about like the whole movie, but it's most apparent in the sequence of the action sequence in the middle, is the sound design in this movie is fucking incredible. And a lot of it is like just like the effects they use for like the Penelope in particular has this very good, I feel like it's got a really like, if you took like a King Ghidorah type noise that he makes when he flies and then mix it with like Bungie Halo like or Destiny like vehicle noises, they kind of like mix it. It's got a very kaiju kind of quality to it, but it's very technical and kind of like techie. Like it's just really imaginative sound design, and I just think like the mix is fucking perfect. Like the dialogue is so clear, but there's so much happening around the dialogue in those sequences where you always know what people are saying and you can hear it clearly, but it also feels embedded in this very rich soundscape of explosions and things zooming past the camera. It is just, I think, like a masterclass of great sound design.
It's some of the best sound design. It's probably the best sound design we've ever heard in Gundam. Like it's not just even in those big busy sequences, it's just in quiet sequences, the way voices feel situated in space to a degree that you don't always get in anime, because it's hard to do. They didn't act in those spaces, obviously. So there's a lot of good mixing there. The music, which we'll talk about in a second, is tremendously well mixed. It's never, you can always, sometimes I feel like you get really good music and then they drown it out or something, and no, that's not the case. It's really all perfectly balanced. And of course, Hiroyuki Sawano is always doing things where the music interacts with the sound effects in some ways too, and so that all helps it here, and it's very, very well mixed. Yes.
Yeah, so the whole soundscape of the movie is just phenomenal. I think that's like one of the things that pushes those action scenes over the edge to be like just as incredible as they are.
Yeah. So let's talk about the music. We've got Hiroyuki Sawano's score, which is great, and we have 3 new vocal songs that will be in contention for the best vocal songs list next year, Sean. And I'm guessing all 3 will be on mine, because at least for this year 3 of Weekly Suit Gundam, because you've got the end song by Alexandros, which is called Senko.
Yes.
It's Flash, which I think is great. You have the insert by Sawano in the middle of the movie, Tracer, which reminds me a lot of Vigilante from Gundam Narrative, but is also like the way it's used in the movie, where it's a sequence where basically Gauman is flying in to the city, but it starts with Hathaway in bed hearing like the dance floor above, and then you go up to the dance floor, which is like the most like expressionistic, like avant-garde sequence in the movie, where they're all dancing, but it's against like just bright strobing lights, and it's not like fully sketched out. And then you have the song come in, and I fucking love that song. And then my favorite song in the whole movie is Mobius, which is the opening credits song, which is just, it's a James Bond opening theme. It's a bit like a latter-day one, like what Adele did for Skyfall, but like better than any of those. It is one of my favorite Gundam songs ever, and I cannot stop listening to it. On top of all of Sawano's score, they spoiled us, Sean. The music's too good.
It's so good, yes. So yeah, I'm with you. I love all 3 of the songs. Alexandros, I've been listening to that band a bit ever since I played Judgment, because they did the song that was in the trailers, and they use it as like the sort of fake TV opening that happens like an hour into the game or whatever. I forget the name of the song, but it's a great song. And then I'm with you with everything with that middle insert song of Tracer, that lead in with like the cutting between Hathaway and the dance floor, and then the lyrics kick in once Gauman comes in over the city. Fucking just great, such perfect editing,
unforgettable moment.
And timing. It's so good. But yes, Mobius, I think, is the one. That song has been stuck in my head since I watched the movie like 3 or 4 days ago. I'm like obsessed with the title drop of the song that happens like 20 seconds in when they say the word Mobius at the end of a sentence. And there's something about, I don't know what it is. It's just so perfectly timed. The rest of the music kind of like drops out as the singer says the word, and then it kicks into, the music kicks back up. But yeah, no, you're like, it is 100%, I think, is very intentionally made in the James Bond opening theme model. But done by Hiroyuki Sawano. It is fun. It plays over the opening credits that come like a good chunk into the movie. And it's like over images of basically like things from the end of Char's Counterattack, of like the new Gundam fighting the mobile armor that Quest pilots and stuff like that. And there's like a Jagan in there, which is always good to see a Jagan. And yeah, it's just, it's like an all-time great Gundam song. It's so fucking good. You just can't stop listening to it once you hear it.
And just to prove my point about the James Bondiness of it all, I did tweet out a video where I just threw that on the Skyfall opening. And it's so well timed, it's literally the exact length of the Skyfall opening. Like, not the song that Adele did, I mean the video part of it from the movie, which is a little shorter. They had to shorten the Adele song for that. It fits very well, and it's very funny to me, because I want to watch that James Bond movie, but I don't have to, because it's called Hathaway, and it's even better.
I was very happy when I saw that you had done that, because as soon as like that opening sequence ended, that was like the immediate thought I had was, someone needs to put this over the opening of Skyfall, because it's like, you're just immediately like, this will fit perfectly. Like, this is exactly that kind of song, and it's so good.
You'll have to go to my Twitter feed to find it. I did try to upload it to our YouTube channel, and they blocked it, so I can't put it on YouTube, but you can find it.
Yeah. So that song is amazing, but let's also talk about just the score itself, because I've been listening to Hiroyuki Sawano's scores for years and years at this point. because he's been around for a long time and his scores are always very memorable. And I think this might be my favorite one. It's either this or Kill la Kill, which is also really phenomenal. But there's something about his score here where I think he avoids the thing that I think is like, to me, like the classic Sawano style is like the big epic music with like the huge swells. Like in Unicorn Gundam is a very good example of this, with like the unicorn theme and stuff like that, where it's just so incredible and you get completely swept up in the music. And he's so good at that. And that's kind of like the standard mode I feel like he's in for a lot of shows he does. It's very much what Attack on Titan score is. It's like the best part of another series called Noah Zero, which is a mecha show that has one sequence that is amazing. That's like this nuke sequence that is very iconic because it's accompanied with this incredible, very epic lyrical song by Hiroyuki Sawano, which is like kind of like famous in the anime community for that, like the way that sequence is put together. And I think what's really fascinating about his score for this movie is he just like avoids that almost entirely. The most there is of that is the GG has a theme that plays at the end, which has a little bit of that kind of epic swell, but it's so much more subdued than like the kind of stuff you get from the Unicorn song or the Arc Zero song from Unicorn Gundam or from the Attack on Titan soundtrack or stuff like that. And most of the soundtrack is much more like soft and bluesy. There's a lot of really great kind of like blues, very bass guitar heavy tracks that play in the kind of day-to-day stuff. And then when the action kicks in, and I tweeted about this, it's very like Ennio Morricone's score from The Thing or like Vangelis from Blade Runner. It's got this very harsh electronic feel to it that like still has some like the Sawano kind of like, I think, musical kind of like trademarks you would look to in terms of style, but is like founded in that period of late 70s, early 80s sci-fi electronica music that fits so perfectly. And you can hear it in any of those like big moments with like big buildup. It more goes for that harsher tone, like the sequence that builds up to Amuro's line, like has that style to it and stuff like that. And it's a slightly different approach than I think I usually hear from his scores. And I think it just works so perfectly for this movie.
Well, it doesn't. It had to, because the standard Sawano approach wouldn't work here at all. Like, it's actually, in retrospect, he's almost a weird choice for it. Because if you think of him from, like, his main Gundam association being Unicorn and Narrative, which is a sequel to Unicorn, it is that classic style that you are describing, where all the best moments of Unicorn are accompanied by these massive, sweeping, swells of melody that, like, are unforgettable, and you're just swept up in it. But Hathaway is not a movie that's trying to do that at all. It's so much quieter and more sort of deliberate and pointed. But he adapts to it amazingly, and it is a phenomenal score that has so many little nuances to it and is so patient with how it doles stuff out. And I think the biggest swell that I remember for me is that shot that I keep mentioning with the fireworks coming off of the Gauman's mobile suit. And it does, a lot of the sound does drop out there and go over to Sawano, but it's a much quieter, like sadder, more somber version of the kind of thing he does than I've ever heard. And it's really striking and different. And then all those electronic elements you're mentioning, it is a tremendous score. And I went and immediately downloaded the soundtrack because luckily it's out there because it was in the Blu-ray that's out in theaters right now. So you can find the soundtrack online pretty easily.
It's also on Spotify. So if people have Spotify, you can get it.
I didn't know that. Okay. Cool. All right. Well, you can find it wherever soundtracks are sold. And it's fantastic. Yeah. It's Hiroyuki Sawano, and the fact that we're going to be getting 2 more of these, what a dream. That's so cool. Because I've always wanted more of him doing Gundam stuff, because his Gundam stuff is some of the best Gundam music. And this is a just totally different mode from him, and that's awesome. Like, the most recognizable moments are like the songs like Mobius and Tracer. But even then, like, the way Tracer is used is very different than how like Vigilante is used in Narrative Gundam, and I love it. I saw some people say like they felt that was out of place because there wasn't quote unquote action going on there, and to me, like, yeah, that's the fucking point. Is it's the build up to what's going to be a very intense kind of, not a lot of music in the sequence that follows. And I think it's such a canny, smart thing to do.
Yes, because that's exactly kind of what I mean by when I say this. Like, it's just not what you usually expect from him, because you expect the, like, classic, incredible Sawano, like, original lyrical insert songs that he does in, like, basically everything he works on. Usually he actually credits them slightly different here, because usually you can identify them by, he has this very weird credit where it's like Hiroyuki Sawano space bracket NKZ end bracket, and those are always the song, and then it's like the name of a musical artist, Aimee, Lisa, something like that. And here he was worked with a trio of artists on Mobius, MPI, Laco, and Benjamin. I think Benjamin alone does the Tracer song. But yeah, here that big lyrical insert song at the middle is used at the build up for the action sequence. I don't really call it a fight because it's not really a fight, but the big action to kind of disaster spectacle sequence in the middle. But the actual spectacle sequence has just this very kind of quiet, intense music in the background for most of it. And normally, Sawano, you have like in Kill la Kill when it's the big action climax of the episode and Riko's big action insert song theme Before My Blood Is Dry plays, and you're like, fucking yeah. And then Unicorn Gundam has a little bit less of that, but does do that with some of its insert songs as well. And then Attack on Titan does that. Noa Zero's like, this is the best thing about that whole show is when it does that. Just what you kind of expect, and here using it for the build up and then having the actual sequence be musically very quiet and intense, I think is so incredibly effective. I think my other favorite use of music and my other favorite piece of music in the movie is his track that's just called Earth, which plays first at when the shuttle is coming in, and it's this very beautiful sequence where you see the Earth and this very haunting, beautiful song comes up that is just like kind of quiet with this very stirring melody, but not a lot accompanying it. And that's when you get the text appearing on screen talking about, it's been 5 years since humanity has moved out into space because of overpopulation, blah, blah, blah. And then it's like eventually it's been 12 years since Char's rebellion. And having that imagery of Earth accompanied with this very, if you've been watching all this shit, like this very dark, sad history of what has been happening that led us here, with that music. It's so beautiful. And then that music plays again during the stuff that you're talking about with the sparks, and then because it starts when the building collapses on them is when that song starts playing again in the middle. And I think it's like a very canny choice to bring that theme up back once again, only there in the middle at that sequence, when it's very kind of tender and intimate. But yeah, great score. I think it's probably my favorite score he's done, which is saying something because I love all the work he's done, but it's just stellar here.
Which also makes it a contender for like our list of best Gundam scores.
Yeah.
So yeah, this movie, you got some of the best animation ever, some of the best music, phenomenal voice acting, great action, great storytelling and writing. It's a pretty complete package, despite being part 1 of 3.
Yeah, I was utterly taken aback by how good this movie was. And I think it speaks volumes that, because I don't usually rewatch movies in like close sequence with one another. I usually wait like at least a couple of months, if not like I like to give it some time before I rewatch stuff. But like I didn't have to rewatch the movie before doing this podcast. I was just like so compelled. I think I would have done it whether we were doing this podcast or not, because I felt so compelled in a way similar to Char's Counterattack to be like, I need to watch this movie again because I just need to. One, I just want to experience some of those big moments, like the action scenes again, just for the visceral quality of it. And then I also want to like sit with these characters in these moments and think about it more, kind of tease out what this movie is doing more, because it is so rich in that way. And that's a very rare quality for a film.
I had to hold myself back from not watching it again like sooner in those 48 hours, because I wanted to do it Saturday night so it would be fresh we record this like Sunday morning. And it just like all day Friday and Saturday I was thinking about this movie, and it was on my mind while I was doing other stuff and just mulling it over and wanting to, and just I was so excited to sit down and watch it again and like apply all of that. And I almost want to do it again now because we've done this whole fucking podcast on it. So yeah. I'm curious when we're going to get the next one, because this one was delayed by a year. I assume they got some work done on the sequel and done in the meantime. I wonder if this is going to be an annual thing for 3 years or what the plan is.
Yeah, there's been no real indication. Like I think the last update relatively recently is they said that they had like finished a bunch of like location shooting, not shooting, but like location reference stuff in Australia, because obviously that's where they're heading. So they're definitely like working on the next one. I have no idea when it'll come out. Like I like hope it would be within a year. I'm going to guess we might have to wait 2 years on it. Like I think there's just like the quality of what they've done with this movie it just feels like they needed that. I mean, because they had been working on this one, it would have been 2 years, assuming that like when they originally teased it in 2018 was around the time they started really working on it in earnest. It would have been about 2 years, and then they more or less tacked a year on it because of COVID. So I'm going to guess maybe it's going to be 2 years. It'd be nice to have it within a year because I want it as soon as possible, because it's kind of hard to resist the urge just to go like buy those books on like Japanese Kindle and just try reading them, because it's the story is so compelling, but I also kind of want to keep myself fresh just to get that for the movies.
Absolutely, yeah. Hopefully soon, but they should also take whatever time they need, because this was great and I want more. Damn good stuff. But next on Weekly Suit Gundam, we'll be going back to the past for Gundam Age from 2011, the next full TV series, which I just started watching the other night. And I do have to say, initial reaction, watching it right next to Hathaway did Gundam Age no favors.
Yes. Gundam Age is, I don't think in most circumstances, it's not really like the best looking Gundam. But especially when you put it right next to this movie, yeah. But
we will be doing the first, I believe, 28 episodes of Gundam Age is the first 2 arcs. Is that right, Sean?
I'm looking it up right now, and yes, it will be the first 28 episodes. Which is basically the movie split into 3, or the series is split into 3 arcs. But the third arc goes from episode 29 to episode 50. Or I guess on Wikipedia they say it's 4 arcs. It's not 4 arcs. It's 3 arcs. It's just the third arc is very long. So we'll be doing that. It'll be very obvious. I think I said this on the last episode, that once you get to those splits, it'll be very clear, because the show has very obvious time jump kind of splits in certain places. So you will know, even if you're not looking at the episode count, when you've hit the end of the arcs.
And we are planning to do that in 2 weeks. So we will be doing the next Weekly Suit Gundam very soon here. That'll be Gundam Age, and then after that will be Gundam Age Part 2, and then we'll move on from there. But the work continues while we're waiting for more Hathaway. We've got plenty of Gundam to tide us over, so I'm looking forward to shooting the shit again on Gundam, Sean.
The next Gundam is right around the corner. I haven't started watching Age yet, so I'm interested to get back into that and see if like how my perspective on it has changed and stuff, because there's very interesting things that Gundam Age is doing. But for now, Jonathan, I'm just very proud that with this podcast, we have another podcast that we can put in the books when we talk about these movies that is now longer than the thing that we actually talked about by a fair margin. Good job.